Did you know there was an official Super Famicom expansion with 2 cartridge slots, and all its games could connect with each other? Similar to Pokemon with a link cable, you could trade and fight with friends, and even steal their characters in battle for keeps. You could also transfer your characters in one game over to its sequels. And every game had a universal currency you could move from cartridge to cartridge to buy the best unlockables at in-game stores. It was one of the most clever add-ons of its time, but unfortunately, time was also its biggest impediment to success. It hit Japanese stores less than a week after the Nintendo 64, and thus was doomed to be overshadowed from the very start. Despite its ambitious goals and potential, the add-on had an incredibly short lifespan. At less than 100 days, it was shorter even than the Virtual Boy. More than half its games ultimately got canned, and nowadays, it's mostly forgotten, even in Japan. Search online in any language, and you'll only find a few paragraphs, and a lot of it's not even accurate. So, we dug up some old Japanese magazines to learn its history, and today we're going to look at the rise, fall, and why things turned out the way they did. This is the full story of the Sufami Turbo. The Sufami Turbo was made by Bandai and officially licensed by Nintendo. In fact, Sufami is short for Super Famicom. The marketing angles that it takes a Famicom that's already Super and kicks it up a notch to Turbo. In our recent videos on the Satellaview, SNES CD drive, and Nintendo Power, we talked about how, in part, all 3 systems were made in response to the skyrocketing manufacturing costs of Super Famicom cartridges. By 1996, $100 games had become the norm, with some retailing for $120, $130, even $150. All those systems were built around alternate methods of delivering software, whether it was beaming games down from satellites, putting them on CDs, or installing kiosks all over Japan for downloading games onto reusable flashcards. The Turbo was designed to tackle the same problem, but with a different solution: mini cartridges. With a 3-pronged strategy, Bandai had figured out how to cut costs in half. For starters, they took some components that are already in normal Super Famicom carts, like the lockout chip, and stuck them in the Turbo instead, along with a 1/4 megabyte of storage that held a text font and other basic data. Now, you might not think that a font would take up a lot of space, but that's over 4,000 Japanese characters stored as sprites, which adds up. By putting all that stuff in the add-on itself, none of it needed to be in each individual mini-cart. Storage was expensive back then, so the second cost-cutting measure was limiting Turbo games to being, at most, only 1 megabyte. That's less than a lot of Super Famicom games coming out in 1996, but still more than enough in the hands of experienced developers. Early generation titles like Super Mario World, Final Fantasy IV, and Zelda: A Link to the Past had all been made with less than a megabyte. In other words, just because storage is low doesn't mean a game has to be small, if you know what you're doing. And third, Bandai dedicated themselves to efficient development cycles. For example, by making quick sequels to their best games instead of building them all from scratch. The most famous example of that strategy is how Ocarina of Time took 4 years to make, while its sequel Majora's Mask took only 1 year, with a fraction of the budget. Turbo series would do the same. By combining all these savings, Bandai could sell games for only $40. The Turbo itself also sold for $40. A lot of games you could get bundled with the add-on for the low price of just $68, meaning a Turbo and 2 games cost less than just one normal Super Famicom title. That was the Turbo's promise when it was first teased in early '96. On April 2nd, Bandai threw a big coming out party for the system, where Japanese press got to play a few games and hear some big announcements. Bandai had the rights to major IP, including Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Ultraman, Gundam, and lots more popular anime and manga franchises. They'd already made dozens of Super Famicom games based on those properties, and now they were bringing a lot of them to the Turbo. Plus some original IP, with a goal of 30 exclusives by the end of the year. The release date was revealed as June 28th, exactly 5 days after the Nintendo 64 hit store shelves. By the way, the N64 only ended up getting 10 games by the end of the year. 16-bit projects were quicker to make though, and Bandai had the development capacity, experience, and the IP rights to make it happen. Japanese magazines were pretty excited, and Famitsu speculated it could spark a new boom for the Super Famicom. To put all this in historical context, the Turbo was sort of a sequel to a Famicom add-on Bandai made 4 years earlier, the DayTac joint ROM system, which also used inexpensive mini carts. The two add-ons even had some of the same franchises like Gundam, Ultraman, and Crayon Shin-Chan. DayTac's main gimmick was its card scanner for adding content to its games, like a Game Boy Advance e-reader. The Turbo, however, had a different gimmick. 2 cartridge slots that, when combined, allowed for some interesting ideas, some of which felt like Pokemon Link cable shenanigans dialed up to 11. Gimmicks get a bad rap, by the way, but aren't necessarily a bad thing. The DS's dual screens were a gimmick, and you could say the Switch's hybrid format is too. Done right, gimmicks can be awesome, and a lot more interesting than just improving graphics or adding more storage capacity. The SD Gundam Generation games were the Turbo's main attraction, and also made best use of its gimmick. So I'll sum up the series real quick, then explain how they utilized the double cartridge slots. There were 6 Gundam games, each based on a different era of the anime. The first was based on the original Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979, the second on Zeta Gundam from 1985, and so on, with the 6th ending on 1994's G Gundam. They're all grid-based tactics RPGs that play kinda like a mix between Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, where victory is achieved by destroying all your opponent's units or capturing their headquarters. Cities can be captured for money, which you can spend to buy new Gundams. And you can capture enemy units as well, in a prisoner of war system that makes some permanent additions to your army. Units can level up with experience points, change classes, and all kinds of stuff you'd expect in a tactics game, plus a little more. If you only had one Gundam cartridge, you'd play it like any other game. But if you had 2, you could transfer mechs you raised in the first over to the second, kinda like carrying your Gen 1 Pokemon over to Gen 2. You didn't have to play Gundam games in order, by the way. You could skip around if you wanted. Another use of the double slot was 2 friends could go head-to-head using the armies they'd built in their own campaigns, similar to Pokemon Link battles. And if you destroyed your friends' battleships, you could capture their Gundams as prisoners of war and keep them forever. If that's too cutthroat though, friends could simply trade with each other for the purposes of collecting and battling throughout their adventures. There were also a couple of fighting games available at launch based on Ultraman and Ultra 7. If you had one game and your friend the other, you could combine them to double the fighter roster. And by battling, you could learn each other's special moves that otherwise were version exclusives. Another interesting mechanic was that every Turbo game had an in-game currency, Turbo Coins, which you earned by beating levels, achieving high scores, and so on. Then you could transfer coins from one game to another, which was especially useful since buying the best stuff like Gundams and the most powerful Ultra attacks could get pretty expensive. For some games, it didn't really make sense to have a store, so for those, you couldn't spend Turbo coins, but you could earn them and send them to games where they could be spent. Like in another launch title, Poi Poi Ninja World, an original IP that played a lot like Bomberman, but supported up to 5 players if you had a multi-tap. You could make custom maps and play on them with your friends, or combine you and your friends' maps into hybrid levels. Poi Poi didn't have a store, but you could rack up cash and transfer it to other games. So basically, all that together's what Turbo was all about. Games at a fraction of the price, with interesting ways to link them together. Although I should mention, there were 4 games that didn't link to anything else, except for coin transfers.
The first was Gegege no Kitaro Yokai Donjara, which featured characters from an iconic 1960s manga of the same name. Here you'll find them playing a board game similar to Mahjong called Donjara, plus a couple more minigames.
Just like Poi Poi, if you had a multi-tap, 5 friends could play at once. Another was Gekiso Sentai Car Ranger, which is basically the original Japanese version of Power Rangers, adapted here into sort of a Mega Man-like melee side-scroller. All 5 Rangers have different abilities, like double jumps, stronger attacks, and running faster. Sailor Moon Fua Fua Panic 2 is a puzzle game with 3 game modes: Story, Versus, and Puzzle. It's a sequel to the original Fua Fua Panic that had come out as a standard Super Famicom cart the year before. Then there was Crayon Shin-chan Rain Boots Splash,
an action puzzle game based on an irreverent 5-year-old from manga and anime popular in the 90s.
It plays kinda similar to Bomberman as well. These 4 games were all standalone, but could still connect for currency exchange. So for example, you could earn some coins beating levels in a Gundam game, transfer it over and gamble on Donjara, double your money, then send it back and purchase some top-tier Gundams, or over to Ultraman to buy some new special attacks. Bandai did their best to make the Turbo a hit, hosting giveaways for 100 free systems and running magazine and TV ads all over the country. Games were coming out at a rate of 1 a week. Bandai was on track for their goal of 30 exclusives by the end of the year. But, unfortunately, they ran into some problems. For starters, the add-on quickly got a reputation for erasing save data if you weren't careful inserting and removing cartridges. Also, the games felt kinda low budget. Even the Turbo's crown jewel, the Gundam games, were all pretty samey, with their main differences boiling down to just the units and maps.
Sameness was inevitable though, considering how fast Bandai was pumping them out. That was, after all, kind of the point of the system. But even still, releasing 6 Gundam games in only 2 months is kind of a lot. But Ultraman was even more egregious. You could easily reach the end credits in under 20 minutes, and Ultra 7 is basically a copy-paste job of the same game, just with different fighters and stages. Each game only had 3 fighters and 3 stages anyway, so they probably should have just combined them into a single game. Maybe you could argue that, like Pokemon, you weren't supposed to buy both. Your friend was meant to buy one so you could link them together, but even granting that consideration, I mean, yeah, mini-carts were less than half price, but a lot of them felt like less than half a game. The Japanese magazines who were initially excited for Turbo quickly lost enthusiasm after playing its games. The Gundam series fared best, averaging 5.5 out of 10 from Famitsu magazine. In their review, they heaped praise on the inventive link mechanics and some of the tactical innovations like Prisoners of War, but complained that all 6 games were too similar, and the graphics looked last gen. The Ultra games they gave 4 out of 10, saying they were too light on content, the combat too simplistic, and felt they should have been bundled in as free pack-in titles.
The rest of the library got 4s and 5s as well, with Famitsu citing subpar graphics, short runtimes, and an overall feeling of cheapness. Now, to be fair, Famitsu is a bit stingier than Western outlets. In their 40-year history reviewing thousands of games, they've only scored a couple dozen as 10 out of 10. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave Super Mario All-Stars a 9, for example, but Famitsu only gave it an 8. IGN heralded Pokémon as a perfect 10, but Famitsu said it's a 7. Point being, a Famitsu 5 doesn't mean a game's horrible, just that it's average. And that sums up how reviewers felt about Turbo games in general, that at best, they were mid. Maybe if the add-on came out a few years earlier, these games might have looked better compared to what else was on the market in, say, 1993. But releasing a week after N64 was just not the best time for budget Super Famicom titles. They were also competing with Nintendo's own add-on, the Satellaview, which also struggled to find a player base in '96. And it didn't help that Pokémon landed a few months before and was currently taking over Japan. By the way, we keep comparing Turbo Link mechanics to Pokémon, but to be clear, Bandai had been working on it before Pokémon even came out. So despite the similarities, they weren't ripping off Game Freak's ideas. Earlier in the year, Bandai spoke about making a linkable RPG series that continued Kart to Kart, similar to how the Gundam games functioned. It never ended up getting made, but does sound a bit like how Pokémon Generations ended up working years later. Technically speaking, an actual Pokémon game could have been made for Turbo, a 16-bit version where you use the double cartridge slot instead of a link cable. Game Freak was unlikely to ever make that game or license out the rights, but it's interesting to imagine if the Turbo had gone more in that direction.
Another fun thought experiment is how things might have gone if they managed to borrow some of Nintendo's IP.
Mario or Zelda launch titles would have been ideal, of course, but thinking more realistically, a smaller series like F-Zero might have been enough to establish a foothold. One of the concepts Bandai teased at launch was a racing game where you can design your own cars and race them against friends with their custom cars. Making an F-Zero Turbo in that style would have attracted some much needed interest in the system. That's just wishful thinking on our part though, because fact is, Turbo just never got any must-have titles to draw in a big enough audience. The Gundam games were decent, but there's only so many Gundam fans who want to play tactics games. The series only appealed to a niche inside a niche, when what the Turbo really needed was something with broader appeal. Even the Daytax Dragon Ball Z Fighter made a bigger splash than Gundam, and that add-on was kind of a flop too. If you want to hear more about the Daytac, by the way, check out our recent video covering NES and Famicom expansions. Bandai never released Turbo sales numbers, but we can get a rough idea from Famitsu sales charts. Every week, they tracked video games sold across Japan and published the 30 best sellers. When the first two Gundam games came out, they barely made the chart, coming in at 27 and 28. The next week, they disappeared from the top 30 and never returned. The third and fourth Gundams ranked 27 and 30 in their launch week, then fell off too. No other Turbo game ever made the top 30, which means sales had to be pretty poor. Bandai pulled advertising soon after, and cancelled all future releases. The last games came out on September 27th, 1996, just 92 days after the Turbo's launch, meaning its entire library only amounted to 13 games. The ones you heard about earlier in this video? That was it. The initial goal was 30 new games by the end of the year, and presumably more were planned into the future. Little is known about what games were supposed to come after those first 13, though Bandai still had Dragon Ball and lots more IP they could have pulled from. Before launch, they'd announced a port of Tetris 2 plus Bombliss, which released as a standard $85 Super Famicom cart a few years before, but now was going to be a $38 mini cart. Bandai had dozens of Super Famicom titles they could have ported over if they wanted to let Turbo fans get them half price. But ports don't appear to have been included in that count of 30, and to be clear, the only one they ever announced was Tetris Bombliss. Japanese websites claim a 7th Gundam entry based on Gundam Wing was in the works, along with 2 more Ultra games.
None of them cite sources though, and 90s magazines like Famitsu and Famimaga never mentioned them.
Searching the Japanese internet doesn't yield any reliable sources either, so we can't say for a fact if those claims are true or not. That said, we wouldn't be surprised if more Gundam and Ultraman were in the cards, since they were the add-ons to main franchises. Now's probably a good time to mention that info about the Turbo is super sparse online, even in Japanese. The Japanese Wikipedia page, for example, is so short it'd fit on a single sheet of paper, and cites 0 sources.
English Wikipedia is even thinner, and doesn't have sources either, and a lot of it's wrong, like most of the game's titles, how linking them worked, and which games were available as pack-ins. It never even mentions Turbo coins.
Pretty much all other coverage online is more or less copy-pasted from those 2 Wikipedia pages. Info and footage for the games is pretty bare bones as well, which is what made us want to dig up old magazines, record some gameplay, and make this video. That, and the fact it's just a super cool premise for a console expansion. 2 slots for competitively priced mini cartridges with games that connect to each other and have a universal currency system. It's an awesome hardware concept. Unfortunately, all that potential was wasted because Bandai half-assed making games for it, then immediately gave up, instead of fighting to get it on the right track. Nowadays, the Turbo's been mostly forgotten, and you can find them on Japanese auction sites selling for even cheaper than they were 30 years ago.
The Nintendo DS was revolutionary. It's as easy as time moves on to overlook the importance of a system when it comes to the wider popular culture. But for Nintendo, the DS was easily one of the most important steps in the video game giant's history. The device isn't unbelievable because of its innovative dual screens or touch controls, but because of its overall ease of access and just how easy it was to develop games for. This meant hardcore gaming fanatics and casual noob-turned-gamers could all rejoice together in perfect harmony across the DS's lifespan. It appealed to both players young and old, and welcomed many new people into gaming with its massive library of games. Speaking of which, we've got some all-new facts for you from DS Classics, but first, some new info on Halo DS. With the DS's popularity, it's no surprise that other companies, who would usually compete with Nintendo, took interest. And Xbox was one of them. Having created titles for the GBA already, the company looked to continue this unexpected support with the DS, and their affiliated studios pitched Xbox their ideas for various dual-screen outings. In 2007, IGN editor Matt Casamassina wrote that he played a Halo game for the DS, but a few months later, Bungie devs denied ever making said game. Halo fans badgered Casamassina for the next year, many accusing him of making the whole thing up for clicks, until he finally proved his claim by playing Halo DS on camera.
We're going to talk about a little game called Halo DS. Once upon a time there was this game that was in development. It wasn't created by a garage developer. It was actually done by a major studio, major publisher, AAA publisher. And at one time they were really hoping to bring it out. Unfortunately, for reasons we can't discuss, it never came to be. Obviously you're not playing it right now. However, we are. Yeah, and we figured there's a lot of doubt about this game, whether or not it really existed. And we figured what better way to, shed some light on that than just to show it to you. So we're going to do that now.
Eagle-eyed fans noticed the game's similarity with GoldenEye Rogue Agent, the first FPS ever released on the handheld. So a theory emerged that Halo DS was made by the same team at N-Space. With only 50 employees, they weren't exactly AAA, but otherwise N-Space being the devs seemed plausible. That theory was unconfirmed for the past 15 years, but we got in contact with a couple of N-Space devs who said it was true. One wanted to remain anonymous, but said, "Yeah, that was us, probably late 2005, early 2006. It was much more than a GoldenEye mod though, with a lot of effort and care taken to craft something that looked, sounded, and felt like Halo." IGN's few seconds of gameplay only showed a version of Halo 2's multiplayer map Zanzibar. The anonymous dev told us that they remember there was also a single-player map not seen in the IGN footage. We asked if Halo DS was going to be a handheld version of Halo 2 or its own unique experience. He said, "In these kinds of pitches you want to keep all options on the table, but every other game N-Space made back then were original works and not ports. So Halo DS probably would have followed suit." Halo DS VFX artist Jim Inciello was willing to go on record and told us a few more details, some that weren't previously known, like that it had 6-player multiplayer, drivable vehicles like warthogs and ghosts, grunts who shot blasters and threw grenades, and elites with one-hit kill energy swords. The demo was made in a pretty short time frame, so it would have been a lot more if it became a full game. N-Space put a team of about 5 guys on the project for approximately 3 months and then pitched it to Bungie and Microsoft. It's long been believed that they rejected the pitch, but the truth is, they actually approved it. Jim told us, "The sad part is that the game was almost greenlit, but about a month after it got approved on the Microsoft Bungie side, it was Nintendo that shut it down. There was speculation that they were unwilling to front some advertising money on a first-party development side, just as they had originally done with Geist, a GameCube game N-Space developed and Nintendo published a few years earlier. But we wound up needing Nintendo's help finishing Geist, so maybe they were a bit annoyed at us. Still, Halo DS would have sold in the millions as a portable online multiplayer in 2006. With the benefit of hindsight, Halo DS probably would have sold like gangbusters, since the DS went on to sell over 150 million units and became the second best selling system of all time. No one could have known that that was going to happen back in 2006 though, not even Nintendo. If they had, maybe they would have fronted the funding N-Space needed, and who knows, with Halo on DS, maybe Master Chief would be in Smash Bros. By now. With all that backstory established, that leaves one last question. Would Halo DS have been any good? Casa Messina said the demo was, quote, "pretty good." The devs we talked to acknowledged that the DS wasn't the ideal system for FPSs, mostly because it lacked analog sticks. N-Space's other DS shooters received fairly average reviews, 7 out of 10s mostly, and this game probably would have scored similarly. Halo DS was on course to be a decent game with an original campaign, Wi-Fi multiplayer, and very importantly, it would have felt like Halo.
But there you go. It's, it's Halo. It plays like Halo. Looks like Halo. Sounds like Halo.
Unfortunately, it never got past the prototype stage, so N-Space ended up making Call of Duty DS games instead. Half a decade later, some of the same guys worked on another Halo game, codenamed Project Hagar, for the Xbox 360, aimed at a younger audience, but it ended up being canned as well. Making a hit game can be difficult in itself, and even when you've pulled it off and now you have a solid foundation, making a sequel can sometimes be even harder. After all, trying to expand upon or outdo a hit game can be quite the challenge. In our search for trivia, we stumbled upon an interview with the developers of Mario and Luigi, Bowser's Inside Story. The interview is from the March 2009 issue of Japan's Nintendo Online magazine, which we had translated into English. Within, former writer and game designer for Alpha Dream, Hiroyuki Kubota, expressed that he felt a degree of uncertainty about how he'd create a new gameplay experience on the same hardware as the game's previous entry, Mario and Luigi Partners in Time. Many of Kubota's existing ideas had already been completely exhausted after Partners in Time, but he was still limited to the same control inputs and specs. The pressure was on. The team initially envisioned Bowser as one to attack by jumping on his enemies, but they chose to focus on his fire-breathing technique instead, along with regular punching attacks. This was because the team wanted to put emphasis on the dynamism between the King of the Koopas and the Mario Brothers, giving both a distinctly different moveset. Part of the initial proposals for the game was that Bowser would become gigantic, but how this would be visually portrayed within the game was a tough act. One of the original ideas was that rather than making the Bowser sprites become larger, they considered simply shrinking the backgrounds. But they didn't find this option to be particularly impactful. Other struggles amongst the team included the late development decision to introduce vertical orientation for giant Bowser battles. The choice for this new orientation resulted in panic amongst the team. From a technical perspective, they found it tough getting Bowser's movement to look smooth and dynamic, and wrestled with degrees of graphical compromise, like having rougher outlines on the sprite when they rotated to maintain decent performance on the handheld. At first, a designer from Nintendo, Tomomi Sano, took on the duty of creating the graphics for Giant Bowser as a result of staff shortages, making a rare occasion of collaboration between Nintendo, the game's publisher, and the development studio for the game, Alpha Dream. Several interesting elements were cut from the game too. A number of enemies can be found within the game's data which went unused as a result of the overall vibe not fitting within the game's concept of inside Bowser's body. Despite being interesting designs, they simply wouldn't fit with the general concept of the game's plot, so they wound up going unused. One concept that wound up being left completely abandoned relates to how Bowser would have been utilized in gameplay. It was initially conceptualized that Bowser would take on the form of a sort of tank, or Zord for you Power Rangers fans out there, while Mario and Luigi would steer his body. The team further developed on the idea of Mario and Luigi being inside his body to be able to better utilize Bowser as a character, with his personality and behavior shining through. With this in mind, the team put extra effort to make sure Bowser didn't take on the form of a full-blown ally for the plumbing duo, making sure to maintain his role as the primary rival of the series, but also ensuring that his goals aligned with those of the Mario brothers. According to Kubota, there wouldn't be much of a plot if Mario and Bowser had different goals. The first idea was to have Mario and the rest use Bowser like a tank. The story about being sucked inside his body came as an end result of trying to figure out how to use Bowser as a character. The game's producer, Akira Otani, added that we were coming up with ideas with Alpha Dream on how to avoid breaking with Bowser as Mario's rival. The hardest part was keeping it from being a game where you become friends with and cooperate with Bowser. Inside Story's difficulty was clearly a huge part of the team's refinement efforts. The devs wanted to ensure that the game was accessible to new players, but also offered a challenge to those with experience. Kubota said, with the difficulty level, it took the longest time to balance it in any game in the series. We had a lot of people play it and fill out surveys, then responded to everything they were dissatisfied with, so I think it ended up the most well balanced as well. As the creators, we're used to it so it isn't difficult anymore, but that's not the case for customers playing for the first time. And it seemed like Iwasaki, who was in charge of battles, had a lot of stress, so we had him make the Battle Coliseum as an outlet to relieve his stress. Only a few people in the company can beat it. The bosses that appear in the story are mainly ones that have to be beaten to finish the game, but I wanted to leave in the fun that comes with facing harder bosses. Another point of consideration was how the team were going to depict the internal anatomy of Bowser. When it comes to the internals of any character, it's easy to go too hard in terms of realistic designs, leading to unsettling feelings and grotesque detail. Instead of going for a realistic look for the character's innards, the team opted to utilize a bright pop art style that remained consistent with the overall Mario universe. Background graphics lead Koichi Fukuzawa made sure to focus on creating the environments within Bowser's body to be both visually appealing but also fitting for the location, avoiding overtly lifelike details such as bones or blood vessels. While Bowser's inside story could have wound up being a little more gross with its details, one game that lets the grossness take center stage was freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupeeland, a title that many US gamers never had the opportunity to play as it was released in English but wasn't published in the United States. We have unearthed details about the game from a pretty weird 10-page developer interview that we had translated from another issue of Nintendo Online Magazine from September 2006. The interview reveals fascinating insights into this quirky title's development, like how work began in 2003 with a rather unconventional pitch that fell flat. As developer Suda explains, "At first, I proposed a character that wanders around half asleep, and I felt that Nintendo gave me a cold stare at that. The project found its footing when the team struck upon a unique gameplay hook." Producer Kensuke Tanabe recalls, "We felt forced to put out something similar to previous games, and as we were hardening on it being in the RPG genre, the topic came up of, wouldn't it be fun if you could solve everything with money? And at that, the sluggish mood of the meeting turned to excitement. This money-centric approach became the game's core concept. Rather than following traditional RPG progression, where characters grow stronger through experience, Tingle was designed as a character who doesn't really grow at all, instead taking advantage of people's desire for rupees to hire mercenaries and gather information. Early development discussions ventured into even stranger territory. Planner Jun Suda revealed, "At first, we also talked about Tingle capturing people in the town, making them wear Tingle clothes inside his Tingle house and forcing them to work. People were hung up or sat down in chairs or forced to do various jobs." During these discussions, the game was still being considered for release on the Game Boy Advance before focus transitioned over to the Nintendo DS, a decision that extended the development quite considerably. This long development was marked by frequent changes in Nintendo's supervisors, introducing a certain level of instability and distrust. Mari Shirakawa, who became the 6th supervisor on the project, recalled a frosty reception at developer Vanpool. "When I first came to Vanpool, it was a pretty harsh reception, like, who the hell are you?" As with any game involving some pretty crazy concepts, not every wild idea made it into the final release. Designer Kazuyuki Kuroshima shared one particularly bizarre cut concept. The chef is just in town in the final game, but at first, we had it so he was buried in a field with only his chef's hat sticking out. And when Tingle pulled it away, he got angry and said, "I was trying to learn how vegetables felt." It wasn't just unconventional gameplay concepts considered for the title, but also a number of marketing strategies that would reflect the money-driven themes of the game. Director Taro Kudo said, "We had a lot of ideas for selling the game itself, like making the price not 4,800 yen, but 5,000 rupees, and you'd have to use Nintendo Club points to buy it." They also contemplated splitting the game into multiple versions, parodying Pokemon's dual releases with titles like Freshly Picked Tingle Left and Freshly Picked Tingle Right, or even North, South, East and West. This was likely a way of poking fun at the money-driven tactic of selling 2 Pokemon games to die-hard fans instead of combining everything into one, a somewhat grounded and comical take on the company's own money-centric decision-making. Considerations were made regarding Tingle's design within the game's release, especially for the Western audiences who had demonstrated a noteworthy distaste of the character in the earlier Zelda games. The team understood that many Western fans weren't keen on Tingle as a whole, even claiming that many American players actually hated the fanciful fairy. Tanabe wanted American Zelda fans to come to accept him in whatever way he could, which led to special attention being given towards the graphics and other characters within the game being more palatable for Western tastes. The game's distinctive voice acting came from an unexpected source. Kuroshima himself provided Tingle's voice after Kudo's initial attempts were deemed insufficient. At one point, there was even a rejected concept to have Kuroshima use his normal speaking voice, as Tingle's design temporarily resembled the artist. Whether that is something Kuroshima should feel honoured about or not is really up to you. Development for the game took place within Vanpool's rather modest office space. When Shirakawa was first introduced to the offices, she was quite surprised, and initially mistook it for somebody's house instead of a game development studio. It is a result of this more intimate team environment that Vanpool's distinctive style could flourish. As Suda explained, "Our way of doing things is to look at each other in the face when we make things." This casual atmosphere sometimes led to culture shock. As Shirakawa recalls, being surprised by team members wearing shorts to meetings. "I was so nervous at first and wore a dress I prepared, and I was greeted by leg hair." The game's distinct visual style was extended beyond the title itself and also landed with the supplemental material that came with it. Comics and skits were specifically designed to look as though they were homemade and cheap, with multiple artists being brought on to contribute. The team wanted to make sure they prioritized fun within the product as a whole. Not an overly refined Nintendo product, but something that had many people having fun with it behind the scenes. While the creation of Tingle's Rosy Rupeeland was riddled with chaos, something that one should probably come to expect with anything involving Tingle, Kuroshima's dedication was evident, as he even jokingly complained, "I'll be thinking of new material while I'm pissing blood every week." Through all the challenges, Vanpool managed to create a game that balanced the company's unique style and Nintendo's expectations, resulting in perhaps one of the DS's more distinctive titles.
Reggie Fils-Aimé is a figure in the gaming community unlike any other, a fact perhaps best exemplified by the very first words most gamers heard come out of his mouth.
My name is Reggie, I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games.
Ever since that fateful introduction, Reggie has evolved into a powerful industry leader, one who isn't afraid to embrace the community's love, and one who carved a powerful path against conventional wisdom, all with a straight face and confident tone. This is the story of how the son of two immigrants became one of the most welcoming faces of gaming's biggest publisher. This is Reggie Fils-Aimé. Reggie Fils-Aimé was the son of two immigrants, born in the Bronx, New York. Both of Reggie's parents were from Haiti and left for America because they weren't allowed to marry in their home country. During the 1950s, Haiti was embroiled in a conflict between its democratic government and military dictatorship, and Reggie's maternal grandfather was a member of the Haitian government, while his paternal grandfather was a general in its military. Despite being well educated, neither of Reggie's parents knew English and had to learn the language in America. His father found work as a mechanic while his mother sold jewelry. Fils-Aimé was raised in Long Island, and as a child envisioned himself pursuing a career in the sciences. He later said that he bought college-level chemistry textbooks while he was still in middle school. From an early age, Fils-Aimé also took an interest in sports, playing both varsity soccer and basketball while attending Brentwood High School in Long Island. Reggie attended Cornell University in New York between 1979 and 1983, where he was the president of the school's chapter of the Phi Sigma Kappa fraternity. Reggie graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Applied Economics. While attending Cornell, Fils-Aimé was chosen by Procter & Gamble as an undergraduate to enter their brand management program, something typically reserved for postgraduate Master of Business Administration candidates. Reggie used this opportunity to follow a path into employment at Procter & Gamble, and worked in their food and beverage division from 1983 to 1991. However, he left Procter & Gamble to work at Pizza Hut as their Senior Director of National Marketing, a position he held throughout the 1990s. During this period, Reggie helped launch and market the Bigfoot Pizza and the Big New Yorker Pizza, and he credits this time at Pizza Hut as an educational experience. Reggie explained, "In the restaurant business, you learn how you're doing the next day." Interestingly, Fils-Aimé was working at this position when Pizza Hut partnered with Sony to launch a line of PlayStation demo discs. How much involvement Reggie had with these demo discs is unclear, but this was his first professional experience with video games. After his stint at Pizza Hut, Fils-Aimé jumped around to several other jobs. This included the head of marketing for Guinness, where he was responsible for all of their brands in the United States, as well as the company's foreign relationships in the United Kingdom, Jamaica, and the Czech Republic. In the early 2000s, Fils-Aimé moved into entertainment-focused businesses, joining MTV Networks as the Senior Vice President of Marketing at VH1 in 2001. That same year, Reggie laid out and executed the marketing strategy for the Concert for New York, a charity fundraising concert for the victims and families affected by the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The concert took place in Madison Square Garden on October 20th, 2001, and generated more than $35 million for disaster relief. Though Reggie was able to boost VH1's ratings by 30% by shifting its focus to younger viewers, his time at the channel taught him a great deal about advertising to different audiences, particularly VH1's target demographic of 25 to 49-year-olds. This perspective would come in handy during Fils-Aimé's next job. In December of 2003, Reggie joined Nintendo of America as the Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing, where his initial responsibilities included all marketing for Nintendo products in the US, Canada, and Latin America. However, rather than being a behind-the-scenes executive, Fils-Aimé was about to make a much larger splash as a face for the company. Leading up to E3 2004, fans became concerned with Nintendo's performance. Though in no true financial danger due to some intelligent investments and a war chest of assets, the common perception of Nintendo had become one of childishness and immaturity in an industry that conventional wisdom said was increasingly geared to adult and mature themes. Additionally, the GameCube was underperforming compared to the Xbox and PlayStation 2, and the Game Boy appeared to be in danger after Sony laid out plans to enter the handheld console market with the PSP. All of this depressed fans in an era where the so-called console wars were driving the industry. These fears were squashed when Fils-Aimé walked onto Nintendo's E3 conference and opened with,
My name is Reggie. I'm about kicking ass. I'm about taking names. And we're about making games.
Everything about this was a stark contrast to Nintendo's image, previously a very reserved company with conservative, dry conferences. Especially while under the leadership of Hiroshi Yamauchi, this new assertive style immediately resonated with fans. The rest of the show was equally aggressive, with Reggie directly calling out Microsoft and Sony, and the reveal of the Nintendo DS, which subdued fears of the PSP taking away Nintendo's handheld market share. The show ended with Reggie revealing a trailer for a gritty, realistic take on the Zelda franchise, something hardcore fans of the series had wanted since Ocarina of Time. Again, this was a drastic change from Nintendo's conference the previous year, where their big reveal was Pac-Man Vs. Perhaps the most important thing Fils-Aimé did during Nintendo's E3 2004 conference was call out the people who wanted Nintendo to exclusively target the same audiences as their rivals. He said, "We're not going to run our company just for hardcore gamers. There are gamers out there who aren't as knowledgeable as you, gamers who aren't your age, gamers who don't have your tastes." This would become the defining ideology for Nintendo for more than a decade, and remains one of their core values as a game developer to this day. Ironically, Fils-Aimé did not write his now iconic opening line about kickin' ass, and actually had to be convinced that it was the right direction to go in. This speech was instead written by a contracted strategist and speechwriter from a PR firm Nintendo hired. It was indeed the right decision, and even had other industry executives praising Nintendo's move. Peter Moore, former vice president of Microsoft's Interactive Entertainment division, said, "It was so out of left field and it was even a little cheesy, but it was so unusual for a Nintendo executive. I think he's exactly what, at that time, Nintendo of America needed." For his performance at the conference, Fils-Aimé was immediately embraced by the gaming community, and given several nicknames from fans. The most famous of these was the Reginator, leader of the Nintendo Regilution. Even if he hadn't had a direct hand in the creation of any of the games Nintendo was making, Reggie became the face that was selling them, and he'd brought excitement and hope back to Nintendo fans. Funnily enough, Fils-Aimé did not know that his performance had become so popular until his then 16-year-old son called him and told him that he was famous. In the time after his debut at E3 2004, it became clear that Reggie was not nearly as outwardly aggressive as that pre-scripted on-stage persona was. As the years went by, he became increasingly soft-spoken and warm, but that didn't mean that he was a pushover either. Behind the scenes, Reggie was working hard to redefine Nintendo's relationship with retailers. Before this, Nintendo had to meet the demands of retailers to guarantee favorable placement of their merchandise in stores, a practice that was perhaps a relic of the era when Nintendo had to convince stores to carry their products at all. Reggie, however, flipped the script, renegotiating so that retailers would only be given inventory if they agreed to Nintendo's terms instead. This was a risk, but the strategy worked, mostly because retailers saw how much consumer demand there was for the Nintendo DS, interest that would only later be rivaled by the Wii, Nintendo's next home console. This success did not come without hard work, however. During the mid-2000s, Reggie commonly worked 70 to 80-hour weeks, and regularly got to work before 8 a.m. Fils-Aimé explained, "I push people really hard. I push our agencies hard, and I push our business partners hard. But I think folks respect is that I do what I'm asking them to do. Long nights, weekends, whatever it takes to get the job done." This hard work paid off for Fils-Aimé, as on May 25, 2006, he was promoted to President of Nintendo of America. And what followed was a time of unprecedented success for the company. Though Fils-Aimé would be the first to tell you that he was not the architect of Nintendo's boom during this period, that was Nintendo President Satoru Iwata, Reggie was still instrumental in that success. He was the one who outlined and executed the marketing strategies that would propel the company's success in the Americas. Though video games had traditionally been aimed towards boys and young men, the DS, Wii, and the 3DS were all marketed with broader appeal. Nintendo wanted people who didn't consider themselves gamers to buy their consoles and play their games. Reggie pointed out that the industry is becoming more and more insular. We're becoming more and more a group of players who are spending money on new systems, but are we growing the industry in total? Arguably not. Fils-Aimé's time working at MTV and VH1 gave him a unique perspective that allowed him to both tap into younger audiences while also appealing to older people that may not have considered buying video games for themselves before. He even pushed Nintendo to advertise casual games like Nintendogs and Brain Age at conventions and events held by the American Association of Retired People. Over the next decade, Reggie worked tirelessly to market Nintendo's consoles to anyone and everyone, whether they thought they might have been interested or not. And because of this, the company saw sales figures unlike anything they'd seen since the Game Boy in the mid-90s. In the Americas, the DS saw just under 60 million lifetime units sold. The Wii sold over 48.6 million consoles, and the 3DS moved almost 23.5 million units. What's more, Reggie welcomed Nintendo's fan community just as much as they embraced him. Fils-Aimé frequently acknowledged and riffed on jokes and memes that were born from his onstage performances or gaffes, like claiming that
"My body is ready,"
while demonstrating the Wii balance board at E3 2007, making him even more likable to fans, journalists, and industry analysts. In 2011, Nintendo began producing a series of online news conferences known as Nintendo Directs, and Reggie was a frequent presenter and host of the program. During these directs, he would also take part in short comedic skits to help advertise games or entertain the viewers, leading to some quotes and moments that are still referenced often by Nintendo fans and pundits to this day.
"And really, If you're neither one yet, what's wrong with you?
Fils-Aimé also broadened Nintendo's online marketing, often partnering with influencers and internet creators for more interviews, stylized debates, and satirical sketches. The amount of communication and transparency from both Nintendo and Fils-Aimé during his presidency of the company is access that fans had never had before, and something unique for a company and an executive even amongst the gaming industry. However, this isn't to say that Reggie's run at Nintendo progressed without any issue. The Wii U, their home console released in 2012, became the company's first major blunder in over a decade. This was due to a bad choice of name and poor marketing that failed to differentiate it from the Wii to everyday consumers. As a result, the Wii U failed to reach the heights of the Wii, selling just 6.49 million consoles in the Americas during its lifetime. However, even in the face of these disappointing sales, Reggie was not one to wallow. In the words of his longtime girlfriend, he is not given to any sort of negative thinking. He doesn't worry, he doesn't waffle, he doesn't waver, he doesn't agonize. This unrelenting positivity would unfortunately be tested in 2015, however. On July 11th of that year, Nintendo president Satoru Iwata passed away due to complications from a tumor in his bile duct. The loss of his boss and mentor affected Fils-Aimé deeply. He gave a speech remembering Iwata at the 2015 Game Awards, during which the cheerful persona Reggie had become known for cracked, and viewers could hear him choking back emotion more than once.
The man was fearless. Finally, on a personal level, he was my boss, and he was my mentor. And he was my colleague. But most of all, he was my friend. And I'm a better person for it.
Still, his forward-thinking ideology led Fils-Aimé to focus on marketing Nintendo's next console, the handheld home console hybrid known as the Nintendo Switch. According to Fils-Aimé, Nintendo needed to be crystal clear in our communication about what the product was and what the product could do, as to avoid similar issues with the Wii U. From the beginning, the Switch was marketed as its own independent handheld device that could be linked to a TV, and its trailers were designed in a way to let consumers know everything that could be done with the console. Bloomberg described the strategy in trailers as unlike anything Nintendo had done previously, and Nintendo even booked a Super Bowl ad for the first time in the company's history to market the Switch. This strategy was successful, and the Switch has already been heralded as a success fewer than 3 years into its life cycle. It has sold just under 13 million consoles so far in the Americas alone. Though Fils-Aimé has never gone on record to say he was directly involved in the development of any games during his time as president of Nintendo of America, he did influence some games that would release, and some that wouldn't. Reggie was at least partly responsible for the inclusion of Star Fox content in Ubisoft's Starlink for the Switch. While attending a closed-door demo for the game with Ubisoft, Reggie was impressed with the potential of the title and invited the developers to personally present it to Shigeru Miyamoto. Earlier on in his career, Fils-Aimé voiced distaste for the Wii title Disaster Day of Crisis, slamming its voice acting as laughable and claiming that it wasn't worth its $50 price tag. The title never reached American shores, partly because of its poor European sales. Finally, Reggie has also acknowledged several fan campaigns to get other titles localized for American audiences. His supposed refusal to have Mother 3 brought to the West has been a running joke since the mid-2000s, and the joke has even been part of skits during Nintendo Directs through the years.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3!
Though Reggie has said that fan petitions do not affect Nintendo's business decisions, he did acknowledge Project Rainfall, a fan campaign to get Xenoblade Chronicles, The Last Story, and Pandora's Tower released in North America. All 3 games were eventually localized for the North American market, though how much of that decision was impacted by Project Rainfall is unclear. On February 21st, 2019, after nearly 16 years at Nintendo, Fils-Aimé announced that he was retiring in that year. Interestingly, the position of President of Nintendo of America was to be taken on by Doug Bowser, the head of marketing and sales, Fils-Aimé's previous position. Reggie recorded a video announcement that was posted on Nintendo's Twitter account, where he thanked fans directly for being so passionate about both Nintendo and about him, once again embracing the nickname Reginator. The news of his departure was met with both sorrow and well wishes for Reggie in his retirement. The very fact that such a farewell video talking directly to his fans and consumers was recorded for a company CEO, usually a very invisible position, speaks volumes to how well Reggie communicated with the fans of Nintendo during his tenure as president. And the fact that people were lamenting his retirement shows how beloved a figure he had become. It is unquestionable that without Fils-Aimé and his marketing genius and approachable personality, Nintendo would not be the powerhouse that they are today. Because of Reggie's work, now everyone, young and old, knows that Nintendo is about making games.
Did you know? At the 2009 Game Developers Conference, Nintendo hardware designer Masato Kawahara showed off an unreleased successor to the Game Boy. This device was a precursor to the Game Boy Advance, and was codenamed Project Atlantis. The Atlantis name was chosen because the system was planned to release during the 1996 Olympics, which was taking place in Atlanta. This system had comparable specs to the Game Boy Advance, and would have been an incredibly powerful handheld for the time. British hardware designers ARM Holdings were contracted to create a power-saving ARM 710 CPU for Atlantis. This chip would have allegedly been so efficient that batteries could power Atlantis for up to 30 hours. However, the ARM CPU turned out to be inefficient for the device's needs, which caused performance issues. The device's internal components and form factor also led to its large size, which was ultimately the project's downfall. It was so huge that it couldn't fit inside the average pocket. While Nintendo were developing Atlantis, they allegedly made a game alongside the system titled Mario's Castle, though nothing on this game exists publicly, and it's unknown if the title was transformed into another game. Nintendo went back to square one on their Game Boy successor, but this left them with a problem. It would take several years to develop a replacement for Atlantis, and the Game Boy was already nearly a decade old. Both gamers and developers were expecting Nintendo to release new hardware that was closer to the performance of rival handhelds. Nintendo decided to develop an updated Game Boy with a faster processor and color display that would satisfy these needs until a true Game Boy successor came to market. In August 1999, word leaked that Nintendo was working on a new handheld system known as the Advanced Game Boy, and just 1 month after the rumors first spread, Nintendo formally announced the Game Boy Advance. After going back to the drawing board, development of the Game Boy Advance took about 2 years. It also took Nintendo just over a year to decide which CPU the system would use. A system's CPU needs to be powerful enough to process the amount of information being displayed on screen. Because of this, Nintendo explored several different screen sizes while deciding on the Advance's CPU. According to designer Masahiko Ota, the team even considered making the Advance's screen vertical instead of horizontal. They also looked into making the device itself vertical like previous Game Boys. Nintendo wanted the system to be comparable to the Super Nintendo in terms of power for easy porting of games, but with some additions. Their desire to essentially make a handheld SNES can be seen in the Advance's early dev kits, which had SNES controllers wired onto their circuit boards. Nintendo also stated that cell phone connectivity would be a major focus for the new system. They claimed that by connecting a cell phone to the Game Boy Advance, players would be able to download and play multiplayer games, enter chat rooms, and read email, all on the Advance itself. In August 2000, Nintendo released more information about the Game Boy Advance, including its design, battery life, and price. Nintendo of America board member Peter Main announced the system would have some kind of modem, but no other information was given. By that time, developers had advanced development kits in their hands, and there wasn't a shred of any internet or network support for the system. The final look of the Game Boy Advance was made by French designer Gwenel Nicolas and his studio Curiosity Inc. This wasn't the only shape Nintendo experimented with, however. Even before the original Advance was finalized, Nintendo tested a clamshell design similar to the Game Boy Advance SP. The hardware team temporarily abandoned the clamshell, believing it to be too thick. One thing the team refused to abandon was backwards compatibility. Nintendo literally checked every single Game Boy and Game Boy Color game on the Advance to make sure it was fully backwards compatible. Hardware designer Ryuji Umezu said, "We're checking all of the previous Game Boy games for compatibility. There are a lot of titles, so that is pretty difficult. We have Nintendo employees along with part-time staff checking all of them." The Game Boy Advance was programmed to switch over to Game Boy Color mode when it detected the contents of a Game Boy or Color cartridge. However, Nintendo Research and Engineering General Manager Satoru Okada couldn't get this code to work. Okada then asked engineers to make a physical switch in the system's cartridge slot to change modes instead. The Game Boy Micro lacked this physical switch, and therefore lost the ability to play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games. The Game Boy Advance had instant and continued success, so much so that Nintendo released a redesigned system called the SP, which was an abbreviation for Special. Former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata wanted to include a sleep mode on the SP, but it couldn't be implemented within their timeframe. Having learned from his mistake, Iwata demanded a sleep mode be included in the Nintendo DS from the start. Nintendo also experimented with a touchscreen panel adapter for the SP, which would also be included as standard in the Nintendo DS. Nintendo even tried using 3D LCD tech with the SP, but they weren't happy with the results. The resolution was too small to produce a pleasing 3D image, and the processing power of the Advance struggled to render stereoscopic images. After the SP, Nintendo launched the Game Boy Micro, but this wasn't the last piece of Game Boy Advance hardware to be released. The Vistian Dockable Entertainment featuring Game Boy Advance was released in 2006, and was a DVD player that could play Advance games. The device was portable and meant for traveling in a car or other vehicle. Because of its specialized nature, the Vistian system couldn't be purchased at general retailers, and was instead sold at car dealerships. Vistian was apparently interested in creating similar products using hardware from the DS and Wii, but neither of these projects came to fruition. Speaking of unusual Game Boy Advance hardware, there's an Advance add-on that was specifically made to help young people with diabetes. The Gluco Boy has 2 full video games and mini arcade stored on it. Whenever the user tests their blood levels with the Gluco Boy, they earn points that can be used to unlock games or purchase in-game items and features. The add-on was made after its creator, Paul Wessel, noticed his son wasn't testing his blood levels as often as he should be. Wessel decided that since his son loved playing his Game Boy Advance, he'd make something that incentivized the boy to check his blood levels more often. Similar to how the Super Game Boy allowed Game Boy games to be played on a TV through their SNES, the Wide Boy 64 allowed gamers to play advanced games on their TV through a Nintendo 64. These adapters were made for private use, and allowed developers and publications to view games on a bigger screen. The Wide Boy 64 was developed by Intelligent Systems, who also created the Fire Emblem and Paper Mario series. However, the term Wide Boy is a generic name for adapters that allow Game Boy family games to be played through a console, and have been made for several Nintendo consoles. In fact, 2 other Wide Boy adapters were made for the Nintendo 64 specifically to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Much like the Super Game Boy, the Wide Boy 64 has almost all of the components of a Game Boy Advance inside it, besides the screen and buttons. Game Boy Advance games also came to other consoles via emulation through the Virtual Console. What's interesting about this is that the Game Boy Advance emulation on the Wii U wasn't even programmed by Nintendo. It was instead developed by the company M2, who are best known for their work on the eShop's 3D Classics series, as well as the Sega Ages series. This isn't the only Advance-related tech that wasn't developed by Nintendo. The technology in the system's Game Boy Advance video cartridges was actually developed by 4Kids Technology. These video cartridges were manufactured by Majesco Entertainment, with the exception of the Pokemon video cartridges, which were made by Nintendo. Using its established franchises, Nintendo made several tech demos to illustrate the Game Boy Advance's visuals, including a Zelda 2 and Yoshi's Story demo. However, other companies have used Nintendo characters as placeholders in their own tech demos. One of these demos is Mario Kart XXL by Daenerys Entertainment Software. The demo has Mario driving around a course with some interesting visuals. The purpose of the demo was to show how multiple background layers can be used to create the illusion of vertical depth. The result is something like having 2 of the SNES's Mode 7 layers rendering at the same time.
The Game Boy had an incredibly long life for a piece of gaming hardware, with it being released in 1989 and not being discontinued until the year 2003. This long life brought tons of memorable and beloved games with it, and despite the system's audio and graphical limitations, it was the first time gamers could genuinely take good and engaging titles on the go. The system was the birth of the Pokemon franchise, which went on to become, well, the Pokemon franchise, that you definitely know about already, but other smash hit titles like Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins also pushed Nintendo into the status of a home entertainment staple. And of course we'll be talking about Super Mario Land 2 as well as Pokemon Gold and Silver in today's episode. But first we want to talk about a surprisingly interesting Game Boy game with a truly unique feature, Mission Impossible. Film tie-ins used to be far more prevalent in the gaming space at the time of the Game Boy, with most of which honestly being a total waste of time. Companies knew that they could make a quick buck selling games to people that had just seen the latest blockbuster, so relatively mundane video games were a great means of extra revenue for small to mid-sized game studios and film studios alike. With Mission Impossible, which was released for the Game Boy Color, a rather unique feature was included in the game which made use of a new addition to the Game Boy Color's hardware, the IR sensor. The game includes the Impossible Mission Force Agent Organizer, essentially a rudimentary PDA at a time when such devices would have cost an arm and a leg. Players could store notes, addresses or messages and then transmit that data from one player to another who also had a copy of the game. However, the infrared sensor was used for something a little more impressive than even wireless communication circa 2000, the ability to use your game's console as a remote control for your TV. The game was able to learn signals used by remote controls for things like radios or televisions, allowing you to change the channel without access to the remote control, essentially serving as a universal remote. This can be handy while at home, though booting up Mission Impossible on your Game Boy Color may be a bit long-winded to switch channels from Law & Order to Countdown. But it would also mean that you could change channels on a TV out in public, if you've configured your system correctly, even working from up to 20 feet away. This essentially grants the player the ability to be their own small-time Tom Cruise, or even smaller-time Tom Cruise. From a major blockbuster film series to a blockbuster game franchise, Final Fantasy Legend is well known for not always being a Final Fantasy game. It's pretty well known these days that the title's branding was changed in the West to focus entirely on Final Fantasy, when the game's Japanese name being Seiken Densetsu, with Final Fantasy Gaiden being its subtitle. But this isn't the only time the game was changed, and this is far from the biggest change that occurred. According to a Japanese Seiken Densetsu guidebook, one of the title's programmers claimed that the game actually began its life as an experimental tennis game. The quote, as translated by Clyde Mandolin, reads, "This game actually started out as an experimental tennis game. At some point, the court turned into scrollable screens, the racket turned into the playable character, the ball into a weapon, the opponent's racket turned into enemies, and the court became what was referred to as the map. And before I realized it, a story was added into it, and then the game was released as Seiken Densetsu. It was a curious experience." It isn't going to be a Nintendo system without some kind of breakout hit Mario title making an appearance. And while the first Super Mario Land was by no means a bad experience, Nintendo made great leaps with their sequel, Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins. The first Mario Land was perhaps limited in its appearance, with Mario being just 10 pixels tall, but for 6 Golden Coins, we got a more detailed look at the plumber and the world he's in. But this more detailed look put a spotlight on how strange the game's art direction and design really was, with things like a Jason Voorhees-inspired enemy and a world made of knockoff Lego. But apparently, the game was originally far more unusual. During an interview with the game's director and designer, Hiroji Kiyotake, he stated, "With Super Mario Land 2, one of our ideas was not to be bound by the conventions of the previous games. However, when we showed our first draft to everyone, they were like, 'I don't know, is this Mario?' We realized that we were on the wrong path. So we toned down that idea and made something a little closer to the existing Mario world." But it seems that the developers may have overcorrected, and later in development tried once again distancing Mario Land 2 from other Mario games. The title originally used the same sound effect for Mario turning into Super Mario as Super Mario World. But halfway into development, the team decided that hearing the Super Mario World sound effect on the Game Boy was just a bit off. And they were afraid that players would become negatively conscious of the fact that they were playing on a small screen, and begin to compare Mario Land 2 with the audibly and graphically far superior Mario World. 6 Golden Coins was also the birthplace of one of Mario's most iconic characters, Wario. Wario didn't just work as a fantastic villain for the series, but could even transition the gap of antagonist to protagonist. Wario Land 2 for the Game Boy was an extremely well-received title, and most likely served as the cement for Wario's position in the Mario franchise. The title received a re-release just a few months after its initial release on the OG Game Boy, which optimized it for the Game Boy Color hardware. In the Game Boy Color enhanced release of the game, while still possible to play on a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color, the save files for both systems were not compatible with each other. For this reason, when trying to play a Game Boy Color save file on the Game Boy, or vice versa, the game will go through a set of menus to delete old save data to accommodate that of the other system. So forget about lending it to a friend and expecting your save data back. Another change between both versions appears in the levels Turn Off the Giant Faucet and Escape from the Teacup. These levels contain a unique fish enemy that grabs Wario and pins him to a wall until he escapes. For unknown reasons, the Game Boy Color release replaces this unique fish enemy with a standard sawfish. Despite this omission, full color graphics for the unique fish are still present in the game's code, so at some point it was clearly planned to remain in the game. Another Nintendo series with a strong following is the curled ball of strawberry milkshake Kirby. Kirby's Dream Land 2 actually contains a fairly large number of secrets and cameo appearances from other familiar faces, such as the mini-boss Blocky, who originally appeared as one of the enemies in HAL Lab's earlier series, Adventures of Lolo. Not only this, but if the player frees the same animal friend as they're already riding, then there is a fairly infrequent occurrence that the sacks which usually contain Gooey will instead contain Blob, a female version of Gooey. This isn't the case in the game's original Japanese release though, where Blob's role is actually taken by Chao, the female protagonist from Famicom Fairy Tales Yuyuki, a Japanese-only Famicom Disk System adventure game by Nintendo. It's also possible to unlock a sound test mode in the game, which displays an image of Kirby, Rick, Kine and Koo all sitting around a table, whilst Gooey and Blob play a piano in the background. Once again, however, this differs from the Japanese release of the game, where Chao can be seen sitting at the piano, recreating a scene from Famicom Fairy Tales Yuyuki. Another of the Pink Puffball's games to hit the Game Boy was Kirby Star Stacker, and this too had a number of elements changed when localized outside of Japan. One of the most notable is the game's various food items being swapped from fairly common dishes in Japanese cuisine to something more commonly found throughout the West. One other thing missing from Western territories was a complete remake of the game, released as Kirby's Superstar Stacker in 1998, exclusively in Japan for the Super Famicom. At one stage the game was set to be localized internationally, but because the Super Nintendo was coming to the end of its lifespan in North America and Europe, the decision was made to keep it exclusive to Japan. Now, Radar Mission is likely one Nintendo-developed game that you didn't keep up with. Released in 1990, the title is a fairly simple take on the classic tabletop game Battleships, and since the general theme of the game is war, it seems Nintendo wanted to sneak in their own little Easter egg to reference another of their popular licenses. In the game, the player uses a star symbol, while the enemy forces use a moon symbol, the same symbols used by the ally and enemy forces in Famicom Wars, as well as the other Wars titles, such as Advance Wars. And now it's time for what probably half of you clicked the video for, some Pokemon trivia. Here's some very obscure trivia from Pokemon Gold and Silver that is so rare it can only be seen by trading important items with your friends. Gaming YouTuber Pika's Prey managed to discover a small piece of text that only appears under certain conditions. In the game, Claire, the leader of Blackthorn Gym, gives the player the task of setting out for the Dragon's Den in order to obtain a Dragon Fang, a key item only found in this location. However, if the player obtains the Dragon Fang through another means, such as either trading it through a Pokemon who is holding the item, or by hacking the item into the player's inventory, Claire will be most upset. She actually refrains from giving the player the Rising Badge, and will call them out for having cheated, as the item has not been obtained from the game's Dragon's Den. She will say, "You did not get that at Dragon's Den. Trying to cheat like that. I'm disappointed in you." The Game Boy was revolutionary. It took gaming on the go and it had some killer games to boot. The only real problems with the system was that it wasn't exactly pocket friendly, and you couldn't see the screen if you had no external lighting. This is often riffed on, but it seems a pretty glaring issue with the system, and viewing the Game Boy games through a modern lens really paints the experience in a different light. But regardless, the games were solid, and Nintendo's first-party offerings were quite remarkable, all things considered. Mario's Picross, Donkey Kong Land, Metroid 2, Link's Awakening, and Pokemon Gold and Silver demonstrated that great products can come in compact sizes, if you consider the OG Game Boy to actually be compact, that is. The experiences of these games may have been limited by hardware, but their design was top-notch, meaning that they continue to see relevance in later years, with Metroid 2 even getting a full remake treatment for the 3DS in 2017. But the idea of remaking the game was much older than that. With the original Game Boy releasing back in the early 90s, Retro Studios had considered remaking the game as early as the mid-2000s. Ben Sprout, an artist with Retro Studios, posted on his WordPress blog in 2009 in response to a Metroid 2 fan remake of the game being released online, stating, "I've always thought it would be awesome to remake Metroid 2. A group of us at Retro even discussed doing it as a side project at one point. Nothing ever came of it, though I still think it'd be fun to remake it as a 3D side-scroller." Another name which appears in Metroid 2's credits is Dylan Cuthbert, widely recognized for his work as the main programmer on the original Star Fox released for the Super Nintendo. In Metroid 2, he receives a name drop under the special thanks section, which according to Cuthbert in a 2016 interview is thanks to the work he did assisting the team, providing programming advice, and helping with the game's optimization while he was working on his own title, X, also released for the Game Boy. Speaking of which, X is an important game in and of itself. In order for Dylan to create X, his team at Argonaut had to create their own Game Boy development kit, a task that was not so simple to achieve. According to Dylan, "We hacked together a Game Boy development kit with a camera pointed at the Game Boy. They'd gotten it into circuit printing and were printing the circuit boards in this bath full of acid. We're not certain, but X may well be the only game that came to be partly thanks to a bathtub full of acid." Our next Game Boy title is Mario's Picross, a great little puzzle game which stood the test of time. This is another Nintendo title that had a whole bunch of changes when it was brought to the West. These included a number of changes to the puzzles, altering what the player must draw out on the Picross boards. One of these was the alteration for a puzzle featuring a picture of a cocktail drink, which was changed into that of a Boo character from the Mario series, essentially changing booze into a boo. It seems Nintendo's main focus was on removing references to alcohol, like with another puzzle that was changed from a glass of wine into a hat, or a mug of beer that was turned into a crow. References to the Buddhist religion were also removed by placing a Buddhist bell with some garlic. A similar change happens with what seems to be a Buddhist guardian, Neo, being swapped out with chili peppers. References to Japanese culture were also changed to more universally recognized images, with the removal of a Japanese tea kettle for a much more recognizable burger, and the change of a hand drum and yokai to popular animals. Another puzzle was changed to remove a cigarette, which is a surprising image to include in the first place, considering it's a game for all ages. Other changes include a toy puzzle having been turned into a unicorn, and despite efforts to distance the game from religious iconography, a fan puzzle was turned into an angel. When it comes to creating a new title for the Game Boy, it makes sense to work on a game specifically designed for pocket adventures, with inspirations coming from games on home consoles. However, while Donkey Kong Land wound up being an entirely unique game in its own right, the original plan was for the game to be a straight-up port of one of the SNES's most graphically impressive titles, Donkey Kong Country. Programmer Paul Mahacek, however, managed to convince higher-ups at Rare that a new, original title would make more financial sense, saying, "Whenever anyone asked me to convert a console game onto Game Boy, I expressed the opinion that we'd be better off writing a new game in the same vein, and that the extra resources to do that wouldn't be much greater than for doing a port, whilst not limiting your market and reducing its size to those people who hadn't just bought the console game. It was a point of view I expressed in 1994 when I was asked to port DKC and instead wrote DKL for Game Boy. This was also a sentiment that Cranky Kong would get behind, as Donkey Kong Land's manual expressed the whole game was made after Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong had a bet with Cranky that they could have fun even without fancy graphics and modern music." Despite this point, however, the original Donkey Kong Country was given a port to the handheld's mid-generation upgrade, the Game Boy Color, albeit a whole 5 years after Donkey Kong Land. Another one of Donkey Kong Land's secrets is that the game was originally going to feature a new animal buddy called Rambunctious. Little is known about what this little fellow could do, and why he never made it into the game, just that they were, a ram. Maybe they were just a little bit sheepish. Hearing from developers who worked on our favourite games gives us some great insight into game creation, a job which for many may seem like a dream come true until you find yourself on the other side. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening was a game that certainly delivered joy to many players, but in the files from the Giga Leaks a couple of years ago, a development note from one of the game's programmers revealed some more sentiments around their work at Nintendo over the years. Left by programmer Kazuaki Morita, the note titled Bearded Uncle goes on to talk about his experience working with Nintendo and his thoughts as he moves forward in his career. It reads, I think there are jobs game developers will never forget, in the same way that people who fish remember their first catch regardless of its size. For me, it's Super Mario Bros. It had a huge 32 kilobyte programming area for the time, and I packed in nearly that much. It was a big fuss even if you had a few free bytes. Then the Infinite Lives, the Minus World. I think the word tricks started being used around this time. I'm relieved they're not always called bugs. It's been about 8 years since then, and I've been involved in various other games, but as I get older, I feel my head is spinning and my memory is weakening. However, I think that my slyness has been only further enhanced. It is often said that a programmer's life is up to 30 years long, but that's just a social custom, saying it happens because you don't have to work, when really it's that you are unable to work. And I think I might quit this job if I feel I've reached my limit, since there's no such thing as a programmer who cannot program. You may be pleased to hear that Kazuaki would stick with Nintendo for many years after Link's Awakening was released, mostly sticking to work on the Zelda franchise as a programmer, though in recent years taking on more roles as a supervisor, possibly starting to feel his age when it comes to his programming tricks. What would a variety of Nintendo games be without the mention of Pokémon? Pokémon Gold, Silver and Crystal came after Red and Blue, so players were of course expecting some riveting new features to their grand adventure. It turns out that there was a feature set to change the game's immersive experience, giving the player a sense of being in the Pokémon world, but it was removed before the game's final release. A fully functional feature that allowed the player to name their mother. This function was included in the data of the Space World 97 demo of the game, which offers the choice of calling your mother Mother, Mama, Mommy, or the option of giving her the name of your choice. A curiosity around this data takes place during the demo's Pokemon catching tutorial, however, in which the player's name is copied to the same location in the game's RAM as the mother's name is stored, suggesting that by the time Nintendo had finished creating the game's tutorial, the mechanism of naming the mother was already planned to go unused. Another bit of interesting content can be found within the game's data. Interestingly, all 26 forms of Unknown have shiny variants, but only the Unknown that are shaped like an I and a V can be shiny. This is, by complete coincidence, due to both how Unknown forms and shininess are dependent on IVs. This means that there are 24 forms of Unknown which have unused shiny variants.
Did you know? Although the DS was very profitable for Nintendo, the system's games are one of the most pirated products in gaming history. In 2010, Japan's Computer Entertainment Suppliers Association published a list of Japan's most pirated DS games. CESA's findings showed that the 20 best-selling DS games were downloaded almost 20 million times collectively in Japan. Pokémon Platinum was illegally downloaded almost 2.1 million times, a figure that nearly matched the game's 2.7 million regional sales. Most of this piracy can be attributed to flash cartridges such as the R4, which allowed users to play DS ROM files using a micro SD card. Nintendo took measures to combat piracy on their platforms, but with limited success. In 2008, Nintendo teamed up with 54 other video game companies to take legal action to halt sales of R4 units. Their lawsuit used Japan's unfair competition prevention law and asked that all companies involved with the R4s to stop importing, selling, and advertising the devices. Unfortunately, Nintendo's actions had little effect, and consumers continued to buy R4 devices online. In 2009, Nintendo publicly called out the governments of China, South Korea, Brazil, Mexico, Spain, and Paraguay. A statement was made about each country and how piracy was negatively affecting Nintendo in each region, in hopes of the governments cracking down on pirates. This, too, seemed to have little effect. The system has a fairly interesting history. The DS wasn't originally intended to be the successor to the Game Boy line of handheld consoles. At the time of its release, Nintendo was still supporting both the Game Boy Advance and GameCube, and the DS was planned to launch as a third pillar alongside these systems. Most likely, this was due to the fact that the DS was a more experimental piece of hardware, and Nintendo didn't want to risk devaluing the Game Boy brand should the new system fail. The DS also marked a major turning point for Nintendo as a company. While speaking about the upcoming release of the DS, former Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi stated that Nintendo's goal at that time was to help lift Japan out of economic depression. They planned to do this by re-energizing the game market, though they were uncertain about the future of their own company. Yamauchi even went so far as to state that if the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell. Despite all concerns, the Nintendo DS proved to be a massive success. As of 2018, it is officially the #1 best-selling game system in the United States and the second best-selling system in the world, after Sony's PlayStation 2. The DS went through several different code names while in development. Its earliest iteration was known as Iris, a name that predates the system's dual screens. The official Nintendo DS emulation software was called Ensata, named after the Iris Ensata flower, commonly known as simply the Japanese Iris. As former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata described, Iris was just the codename of next-generation hardware designed to succeed the Game Boy Advance. It's often speculated that the Ensata emulator was developed by Intelligent Systems. However, there is little evidence to prove this. The code of Ensata only has copyrights relating to Nintendo, which implies it was developed in-house. The source of this confusion may have been the fact that Intelligent Systems developed the hardware tools for the DS. Before the handheld was officially revealed, leaks indicated that its final name kept going back and forth between the Nintendo DS and Nintendo Nitro. In an Iwata Asks interview, Iwata confirmed that Nitro was one of the codenames used for the device. As a holdover from when it was codenamed the Nitro, the serial numbers printed on DS game cards all begin with the letters NTR. The final name for the system, the Nintendo DS, actually has two meanings. On the surface, it stands for dual screen. However, according to Nintendo, it also stands for Developer's System, as it was meant to give game creators brand new tools which will lead to more innovative games. In 2004, Nintendo filed a trademark for game hardware under the name City Boy, suggesting that this might have been another name considered for the DS. According to games journalist Emily Rogers, the City Boy name was meant to help market Nintendo's handheld systems to a younger, more modern demographic. It was also chosen to compete against the growing mobile phone game industry. The Nintendo DS also has the unique distinction of being physically carried to the highest point on Earth. Mountain climbers Neil Mueller and Chris Grubb brought their DS systems with them during their ascent of Mount Everest. While most of the team's electronics were ruined during the climb, their DS systems survived the entire ascent. The devices managed to endure the bitter cold, fierce winds, and having curry spilled directly on them while the team's Sherpa guides played them in the kitchen. A large part of the DS's international appeal was its lack of region locking, as all DS systems can play any game from any region. The only exception to this is the Chinese version, known as the iQDS. This version of the DS can still play games from any region, but games released specifically for the iQDS are region locked and cannot be played on regular DS systems. Attempting to do so will simply trigger a message that says, "Only for iQDS." Oddly, this region locking only functions on the original DS, as all versions of the DSi and 3DS can play iQDS games without issue. Only 6 games were released for the iQDS: Super Mario 64 DS, New Super Mario Bros., Yoshi Touch and Go, WarioWare Touched, Polarium, and a version of Nintendogs that came pre-installed on the upgraded iQDSi. Another region-specific quirk can be found while setting up the DS's Wi-Fi connection settings. Japanese DS systems have an option to connect to the internet using a portable Wi-Fi router. Because these routers are used almost exclusively in Japan, the option to use it was removed internationally. However, there is a workaround for users to access the option outside of Japan. In order to do so, the user has to specifically calibrate the touchscreen incorrectly by touching the bottom right corner of the screen when asked to touch the middle. While on the Wi-Fi setup menu, this option can then be accessed by touching the very top left corner of the touchscreen. This is still possible to do even in the 3DS's version of the menu. The Nintendo Wi-Fi connection instruction booklet included with the DS also contains an interesting secret. One page of the booklet explains the steps to input a WEP key in order to connect to a wireless router. In the example picture, the code used for the WEP key is 8675309. This is a reference to the 1981 pop song 8675309 Jenny by Tommy Two-Tone. This isn't the only Easter egg for the DS system. If the player starts up their DS on their birthday, the boot-up sound will have a slightly higher pitch. And if they continue into the PictoChat application and go to a room, they will receive a happy birthday message. Although having multiple brightness levels was an advertised feature of the DS Lite, later shipments of the original DS actually had support for multiple brightness levels as well. However, there was no way to actually take advantage of it outside of homebrew applications. The DS and DS Lite eventually received a significant hardware overhaul in the form of the DSi, which included new features such as cameras and SD card support. The system's name was inspired by the Nintendo Wii, with the single I meant to convey individuality and emphasize the idea of players personalizing their own systems. The sound editor was included as a last-second addition at the insistence of Shigeru Miyamoto, which actually contains an interesting Easter egg. While on the sound selection menu, if the player highlights one of their recorded sounds and waits for about a minute, the sound editor will start playing a rendition of the Super Mario Bros. Theme, composed from the highlighted sound. The DSi's cameras were a key component to the system's redesign. Satoru Iwata compared the device's microphone and touchscreen as its ears and sense of touch, so the cameras were intended to give the system eyes. The DSi included two cameras, one on the front of the system and one on the back. These cameras actually take pictures at a resolution 2.5 times greater than the resolution of the DSi's screen, so the pictures could be zoomed in without losing detail. Originally, the design team only intended to include one camera and make the top screen able to swivel around in order to take pictures both in front and behind the system. However, the swivel mechanic was deemed too expensive and impractical, so the decision was made to include a camera on both sides. Another feature that had to be cut was a second game slot, something that had been heavily requested by both fans and Nintendo employees. Upon the first presentation of the DSi prototype, however, company executives expressed concern at the system's bulk, and the second game slot had to be removed in order to make the DSi smaller.
Did you know? Waluigi was created out of necessity. During the development of Mario Tennis on the Nintendo 64, most of the game's roster was made up of animals and non-humans. Adding to this, every character had a partner for doubles, like Mario and Luigi or Yoshi and Birdo. This wasn't the case for Wario, however, who didn't have a similar character to pair with. Camelot designer Fumihide Aoki then came up with the idea to make a rival for Luigi, and Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto was brought on for additional consultation. Several names were brainstormed for the new character, with names like Waigi, Jiroji, and Jinanji. Eventually, the team decided on the name Waluigi, though the name may sound somewhat lazy to Western fans, seeming like the Wa prefix was just attached to Luigi's name. It's actually rooted in Japanese etymology. The name is a combination of the Luigi name and the word Wauri, meaning bad, literally translating out to bad Luigi. It may also take inspiration from the word Ruigi, meaning similar. The name is also an anagram of the Japanese word Ijiwaru, which can translate to several terms for rude behavior, including cruel, ill-tempered, and malicious. Wauri can also translate out to words like hateful, poor, and inferior, all of which are traits of Waluigi's character. An upside-down L symbol is used in Greek as the uppercase letter gamma, but also appears in Cyrillic writing. Interestingly, Waluigi was the fourth brother added to the Mario Quartet, and the upside-down L symbol is the fourth letter of the Cyrillic alphabet. Much like how Wario has exaggerated traits of Mario, like his round, portly physique, Waluigi would be comparable with Luigi's design. This was pushed to the extreme with his taller and slimmer features, as well as him being the same age as Luigi. Mario Tennis also reintroduced Daisy to the Mario series, as Camelot wanted Luigi to have a partner similar to the pairing of Mario and Peach. During Waluigi's creation, there were talks of female pairings for him and Wario, one of which was a Wario-style Peach character named Waru Peachy. However, Miyamoto quickly rejected those ideas, saying he didn't even want to see what their girlfriends might look like. Waluigi's design was then refined by Yoichi Kotabe, a Nintendo artist who primarily worked on the Mario series, finalizing immortalizing many of the Mario characters' current designs. The design is also believed to have roots in the character Foreman Spike from the 1985 game Wrecking Crew. Though Spike's original look bears very little resemblance to Waluigi now, he received a redesign in Wrecking Crew 98, sporting a look similar to Wario and by extension Waluigi. In Mario Kart DS, Waluigi's Gold Mantis Kart resembles Spike's excavator from the Japan-only title Mobile Golf, and in DDR Mario Mix, Waluigi's Destruction Dance theme is a remix of the bonus theme from the original Wrecking Crew where Mario competes with Foreman Spike. Mario Tennis Power Tour on the Game Boy Advance marks the only time where Wario isn't playable, but Waluigi is. Waluigi has always been tied to Wario, but their actual relationship is unclear. During the release of the original Mario Tennis, Nintendo's website claimed the two were siblings, with Wario being the older brother. This would make sense as it would perfectly parallel the Mario brothers, as Luigi is the younger and taller of the two. The claim was further backed up in the game's Prima Guide and through a few sources at Nintendo of Europe. This includes Europe's site for Mario Kart DS and in a series of articles on the main Nintendo Europe site titled Wario's Warehouse, which commonly shed light on the two's lives. When Wario writes in the first person, he refers to Waluigi as his brother on two separate occasions. And in Smash Bros. Melee and Brawl, Waluigi's trophies state their relationship is a mystery. Nintendo's current stance on the matter is that the two don't appear to be brothers, according to Waluigi's bio on the Japanese website. In an interview with the voice of Wario and Waluigi, Charles Martinet, he said he doesn't believe they're related, instead thinking that they were just two nice evil guys who simply found each other. Martinet has also said that where Wario's defining trait is jealousy, Waluigi's self-pity is the cornerstone of his character. In Mario Tennis 64, his main reason for disliking Luigi is because of how well-liked Luigi is and wishing to beat him and take his place. It's also been suggested that Waluigi has a crush on Princess Daisy. While evidence is limited, it was first hinted at in Mario Party 4's official guidebook and it's been shown Daisy does not return his emotions. When paired up in Mario Party 5 and 6, one of their team names is Awkward Date, and in the Mario Baseball games, the two share bad chemistry together. In Fortune Street, when Daisy lands on one of Waluigi's average price shops, she feels disgusted she had to stop on a spot owned by Waluigi, and on lower priced shops, she'll say it looks disappointing, but given Waluigi owns it, she's not surprised in the slightest. It's been shown that no one in the Mushroom Kingdom thinks very highly of Waluigi. Though he's appeared in over 50 games, he's the only member of the regular Mario cast to never starred in a game of his own or have any kind of role in the mainline Mario series. Nintendo themselves have acknowledged Waluigi's lack of significance multiple times. In Super Mario Odyssey, the description for the Waluigi suit states, "This outfit makes you want to lurk in the shadows, waiting for a turn in the spotlight," and his hat description states, "Hardly anyone ever wears it." Waluigi was an unlockable character in Mario Tennis for the Game Boy Color, which was only accessible via the Transfer Pack add-on. Because of this, it's impossible to play as Waluigi in the Virtual Console release of the game, along with Wario, Bowser, and Yoshi. Waluigi strangely does not appear in Mario Kart 7, even though his stage, Waluigi Pinball, does. This is his only absence in the series since his debut in Double Dash. As the most recent Super Smash Bros. Game, Smash Ultimate, Waluigi is the only member of the Mario Quartet not to be playable, again appearing as an assist trophy. During development of the fourth Smash, Waluigi was shown to be an assist trophy through the Smash director Masahiro Sakurai's pick of the day. Sakurai made a note of this with the accompanying quote, "Just because you try hard doesn't mean you'll make it into the battle." Waluigi also has a spot in the Nintendo Monopoly board game where characters represent Monopoly properties. Being in the place of Monopoly's Mediterranean Avenue and Old Kent Road, Waluigi is the least profitable space in the entire game, costing only $60. Despite Nintendo's jabbing of Waluigi, they've at least honored him in some form, and the Nintendo America headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Many of the headquarters rooms are named after core Nintendo characters such as Mario and Link, with room 2011 being named after Waluigi himself.
Did you know? Wario first appeared in the 1992 Game Boy title Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins. The game was developed by Nintendo's R&D 1 team who made Metroid and Kid Icarus. R&D 1 avoided working on franchises they didn't have a hand in creating and found it much easier to invest in characters they had made themselves. This led to them creating Wario to act as Super Mario Land 2's antagonist. Wario was an exaggerated opposite of Mario, and the team believed he helped symbolize their situation. The character proved to be very popular and even took over the Mario Land series of games, which became Wario Land. In Wario Land 2, Wario can undergo special transformations when hit by enemy attacks. One such enemy is a penguin that throws balls. Getting hit by these balls will cause Wario to turn red and stagger around uncontrollably until doused with water, which seemed to make little sense. However, in the original Japanese version of the game, the penguins threw mugs of beer rather than balls. Wario was intoxicated by the beer when hit, but this was censored in the West. The Wario Land series went on hiatus for around 7 years, but saw a revival on the Wii with the release of Wario Land Shake It. The game's producers Takehiro Harada and Etsunobu Ibisa wanted to make the ultimate 2D game with Shake It. Everything in the title was hand-drawn, with no repeated backgrounds. The amount of animation necessary for this was gargantuan. A single action for a character required about 30 frames, leading to 2,000 individual frames for Wario's movements alone, and a further 6,000 for the game's enemies. According to program director Koichi Yagi, the scenery by itself would have filled up the Nintendo GameCube. The Wario games have an odd history of being released either very early or very late in a system's lifecycle. Wario's Woods is both the last officially licensed game for the NES in North America and the only NES game to receive an ESRB rating due to the ratings board being established in 1994. Wario Land 2 is the last first-party Nintendo game to be released for the Game Boy. Conversely, the WarioWare games Touched, Snapped, and Smooth Moves were launch titles for the Nintendo DS, DSi, and Wii respectively. The inspiration for WarioWare came when series director Goro Abe and his team were working on a Nintendo 64 disk drive game called Mario Artist Polygon Studio, an art program where the player could create and animate their own polygonal 3D models. The program included a mode where the player would have to complete several quick minigames in rapid succession. This mode inspired several team members of R&D 1 who wanted to base an entire game around the concept. They began work on the idea without telling their supervisor, arbitrarily choosing Wario as its star because Wario was always doing stupid things and was really idiotic. When the team members eventually came clean, the project was approved, and WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro Games was released for the Game Boy Advance. In explaining the game's concept, Abe stated, "With the first WarioWare game, it wasn't so much the specific character of the game that marked it out, but rather that Nintendo was quite a different company back then. Both inside and outside of the company, there was a distinct image that we only produced Nintendo-style games. WarioWare was born out of a desire to depart from the norm, with that particular kind of fun that you only get when you make something different." When Nintendo decided to release WarioWare Touched as a launch title for the DS, the team was already deep in development on WarioWare Twisted for the Game Boy Advance. In order to get Touched off the ground, a new team was assembled. However, almost every member of the team was a newcomer to the series, and they struggled to capture the humor of a WarioWare game. This prompted series producer and Metroid co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto to step in. When work on Twisted was complete, the regular WarioWare team also helped to ensure Touched humor was in line with the rest of the series, and that the game was finished in time for the DS's launch. The game's release, however, generated some controversy. One of the unlockable in-game extras was a record that played Ashley's song, and the player could spin this record on the touchscreen to control the song's speed. According to some, if the record was spun fast enough, it would produce a voice saying, "I have granted kids to hell." Nintendo refuted these claims, explaining the supposed lyrics were derived from the verse "Eye of Newt, I cast a hex on you, Grandma's wig, this will make you big, kitten spit, soon your pants won't fit." By speeding the song up, only certain syllables were played, resulting in the misheard lyrics, "Eye of Grand, this kitsu pan." In the Japanese version of Ashley's song, she casts the spell. When read backwards, the spell says, "Umedo inu Wario is Junanuba 1," or roughly, Made in Wario is number 1, Made in Wario being the Japanese name for the WarioWare series. WarioWare Snapped, another game in the series, released as a downloadable game. Difficulties with reliably incorporating the camera into the gameplay almost forced Nintendo to release the game on a cartridge with unusual peripherals. According to Intelligent Systems employee Taku Sugioka, if there were a ravine and characters couldn't cross, you could use a silhouette of your finger as a bridge to allow them to cross. But when we started testing it out, we learned the camera was having difficulty detecting the hand, so we laid a black mat underneath so shadows wouldn't form and distort the detection. But then, someone with a dark suntan wouldn't be detected, so we made a finger sleeve for the player's index finger. Anyone, regardless of variations in skin tone, would be able to play. We were seriously considering selling the game together with the finger sleeve and black mat. The main draw in WarioWare Smooth Moves was its different forms, or ways for the player to hold the Wii remote during gameplay. While working on the in-game descriptions for the forms, Abe and Sakamoto discussed how to make them sound more over the top. At that moment, a Canadian member of the team walked by their window, and Sakamoto spontaneously asked him to record some lines of Japanese dialogue. The voice of a non-native speaker ended up being exactly the feel they were looking for, and his voiceover was used in the final release. Unlike the Wii U didn't feature a WarioWare launch title. Instead, a team of developers, including Abe, was tasked with creating a number of small games to come pre-installed on the Wii U to show off the gamepad's unique functionality. The team came up with so many ideas that they decided to produce a standalone title instead. However, the ideas were so different from each other that they had difficulty tying them together thematically. About a year into development, the team decided to use WarioWare characters to provide a unifying narrative for the collection, and the project became Game & Wario. The creative freedoms that developers had with Wario allowed them to give him more personality. One example can be found in Wario World for the GameCube. The game is known for its grating pause screen music, where Wario endlessly sings a mocking tune. However, if the player withstands Wario's song for a full 50 minutes, he will actually apologize to them.
Did you know? The Nintendo 3DS wasn't the first system Nintendo wanted to make 3D. As well as the obvious Virtual Boy, Nintendo tried to implement 3D in several other consoles. However, none of these attempts progressed well enough for them to publicly announce the hardware. A 3D screen accessory for the GameCube got very far into development. The device even had a 3D version of Luigi's Mansion running on it. But plans to produce the screen were put aside due to high costs. Nintendo secretly displayed this 3D screen at E3 2002, but left it in 2D mode and neglected to tell anyone that it was actually capable of 3D. Interestingly, it displayed footage of Luigi's Mansion, Metroid Prime, and an early version of Phantasy Star Online Episode 3, perhaps suggesting that all three games had 3D iterations. Nintendo also tried using 3D LCD tech with the Game Boy Advance SP, but they weren't happy with the results. Former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata told VentureBeat, "When we saw 3D images on the Game Boy Advance SP, we saw the resolution wasn't good, and the parallax barrier display available wasn't functioning well. The graphical processing power of the GBA also wasn't good enough." A parallax barrier is a filter placed in front of a screen to achieve 3D without glasses. With this kind of 3D, a screen will show two different images from slightly different angles. These images are broken up into vertical columns of pixels and then interlaced. A parallax barrier blocks one set of columns from being viewed by the left eye and another set of columns from being viewed by the right eye. And because of this, each eye sees a separate image. The brain then processes these two images in the same way it processes depth in the real world, creating the illusion of 3D. Although simple and effective, this technique also has its shortcomings. All LCD displays have a fixed pixel resolution, so when two images are interlaced on screen this way, the horizontal resolution is effectively cut in half. With 3D, the Game Boy Advance's resolution of 240 by 160 pixels would have seemed more like 120 by 160, which is fewer pixels than the original Game Boy. One way around this would have been to double the resolution to 480 by 160, but this would mean rendering twice as many pixels and putting more strain on the hardware. Creating 3D images by layering 2D games also sharpens the edges of objects, which would have made the Game Boy Advance's low-resolution sprites seem even more pixelated. Despite this, Iwata seemed to be fond of the Game Boy Advance prototype as he kept it in his personal drawer. 3D was important to several members of Nintendo's management, including Gunpei Yokoi, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Iwata. In fact, the first project Iwata and Miyamoto worked on together actually featured 3D. It was a Japan-exclusive racing game starring Mario and Luigi called Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally. Co-developed by Nintendo and HAL, it utilized the commercially unsuccessful Famicom 3D system. In an Iwata Asks interview, Miyamoto described the 3D feature as having universal appeal, and believes this appeal is why Nintendo tried so many times to make 3D work. Nintendo's main concern with 3D was the consumers. They might not own a compatible TV or be willing to purchase expensive equipment to play 3D games. And if Nintendo were unable to bundle the necessary accessories for a 3D console at launch, not everyone would buy the required hardware. This would negate the point of designing games with 3D in mind, and is what ultimately stopped them from producing 3D products. Miyamoto has stated that Nintendo tried to work 3D into all of their hardware after the Virtual Boy up until the launch of the 3DS, but this apparently wasn't the case for the original DS. According to Iwata, they never thought of doing 3D with the DS, partially due to their previous failed experiments. They were also focused on the dual screen and touchscreen concepts and couldn't focus on or afford to implement anything else. The natural power increase of the 3DS helped Nintendo embrace 3D. The device was powerful enough that they didn't have to deal with the issues that halted the 3D Game Boy Advance prototype. Similar to the unused GBA prototype, the 3DS uses a parallax barrier to present 3D. Nintendo tried to implement 3D with both of the 3DS screens, but ran into problems with the touchscreen. Iwata explained, "As we experimented, we realized that finger marks and other smudges reduced the 3D's impact, and so did the decreased transparency of the touchscreen itself. In other words, a touchscreen and 3D screen do not get along very well." Screens were originally tested using a 3D render of Mario and Luigi, but were later tested using a special 3D version of Mario Kart Wii. Nintendo also tried to innovate outside of 3D. There was actually a 3DS prototype where the D-pad and circle pad could switch positions. For a time, Nintendo considered putting this functionality into the final product, allowing players to physically move the inputs around. Unlike the DS, engineers made the 3DS as small as possible from the outset, which is why the system never received a smaller revision such as the DS Lite or DSi. Surprisingly, the most difficult part of the 3DS to implement may have been the cameras. Although they aren't high-end, the cameras needed to be very precisely aligned. If even one of the cameras was slightly off angle, taking 3D pictures just wouldn't have worked properly. The 3D depth slider on the side of the 3DS was first suggested by a Nintendo engineer and then personally requested by Miyamoto. Since people have varying levels of visual impairment and comfort, having a fixed amount of 3D could cause eye strain for some players. Miyamoto also wanted a physical slider on the outside of the device so players could change 3D without opening a system menu. He even suggested its importance would be equal to a volume control slider. Nintendo took every precaution necessary to protect its customers' health. They warned that children 6 years old and younger shouldn't use the device's 3D mode, and even added a parental feature to restrict 3D. Despite Nintendo clearly stating any possible health risks, there was still backlash, and many parents were concerned. Several experts weighed in on the issue, with Karen Sparrow of the Association of Optometrists stating, "Children need a clear, sharp image in each eye in order for their vision to develop properly. If a child spends excessive time using a device such as the 3DS, it could effectively act as a negative exercise, causing a lazy eye." Nintendo eventually created a version of the console without 3D, the Nintendo 2DS, to fully address these concerns. However, experts from an entirely different organization believe the 3DS may have medical benefits. Michael Dunas of the American Optometric Association said the 3DS could help identify depth perception issues in young children. If a child has trouble perceiving the 3D, they may need vision therapy, and the issue is much easier to fix if caught at a young age. Interestingly, Nintendo didn't announce the 3DS at E3 or a similar press conference. Instead, the company unceremoniously disclosed its existence at an investor meeting. The timing of the announcement was curious as it drew attention away from Nintendo's recently launched DSi XL. Several news outlets speculated that Nintendo revealed the 3DS early to circumvent impending leaks before E3. However, despite Nintendo's efforts, some features of the 3DS were leaked over a year before it was officially announced. In February of 2010, an anonymous third-party developer told CVG that the DS's successor would have motion sensing technology similar to an iPhone. Although new to handhelds, this feature was actually considered for the original DS. Miyamoto told the New York Times that he wanted to include some sort of tilt or gyroscopic technology in the DS, but left the functionality out to focus on the dual screens. The Street Pass capabilities of the 3DS were inspired by similar features in Nintendogs and Dragon Quest IX for the DS. The 3DS has other more obscure inspirations. In 2006, the Shiguriden Museum was founded by former Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. The museum presents an anthology of 100 classic Japanese poems using modern technology, and the museum can even be toured using the Nintendo DS. When Shigerudan was being set up, Yamauchi wished that the exhibits could jump out at the visitors, and from his desire, some experimentation was done using 3D displays. Yamauchi had a reputation of being somewhat of a visionary, and even came up with the original idea of having 2 screens on the DS. Yamauchi's desire for 3D exhibits would eventually come to fruition, only not at Shigerudan. The Nintendo 3DS Guide Louvre is an app designed for visitors of the Louvre Museum in Paris, and has been available since April of 2012. It was originally intended only to be installed on rentable 3DS units at the Louvre, but a home version was also released on the eShop in 2013, and a physical version was made available at the Louvre's gift shop. Interestingly, this application is the only software on the Nintendo 3DS that is region-free, with Nintendo reasoning that since the artwork at the Louvre didn't need an age and content rating, it didn't need a region lock either. Though the 3DS has gone on to be a successful system, selling nearly 60 million units worldwide, the console initially struggled to sell. In an attempt to attract more gamers to the handheld, Nintendo cut the price of the 3DS from $250 to just $170 in the US only 6 months after its release. Its failure hit the company so hard that Iwata took a 50% pay cut, with other key members of staff taking 20 to 30% reductions in pay as well. The company also introduced the Nintendo 3DS Ambassador program to compensate early adopters who bought the console at full price. This offered them a set of free NES and Game Boy Advance games from the Virtual Console. The 3DS also has several secrets and Easter eggs, some of which are rather strange. Inside the 3DS, there's a stereoscopic image of a rhinoceros skull. This image was likely used for testing purposes, and can be found in the system's debug MPO folder. Another 3D image can be found in the data for the Street Pass Me Plaza, again likely used to test the 3D. The 3DS eShop also contains the title theme for Mario Kart Double Dash. The exact purpose of the music is unknown, but it has some relation to testing Street Pass.
Did you know? Similar to how Cranky Kong was an aged-up take on the original Donkey Kong, Diddy began as a redesign of Donkey Kong Jr. In 2015, Rare designer Greg Mail shared pictures from a book titled Donkey Kong and the Golden Bananas over Twitter, showing some early concepts for Donkey Kong Country. One page shows Diddy while he was still proposed as an update to Jr., but Nintendo felt this redesign was too different to what came before. They asked Rare to either keep Jr.'s old look or to make this new design an entirely new character. Rare felt the design fit their update to Donkey Kong's world and made him a new Kong. After a few naming attempts, they settled on the name Diddy, a slang term for small in some parts of the UK. Diddy's final design was done by Rare artist Kevin Bayliss, who we reached out to for further details. Bayliss wanted a friendlier looking design in contrast to Donkey Kong's more ill-tempered look. He also gave Diddy a tail so he could grab onto objects or even use it as a spring. Diddy's shirt and hat were added to make him stand out from the greens and browns of the backgrounds, and were colored red to match up with DK's tie. The clothing idea also came from a series of UK commercials for T-brand PG Tips, where chimpanzees were dressed in various clothes. The chimps were provided by Twycross Zoo, located very close to Rare, and is also where the team gained inspiration for other DK characters. Diddy was made to serve as a second hit for the player, one that wouldn't get in the way. For Country, the team wanted the game's screen to be as clutter-free as possible. Taking inspiration from Mario's changing in size, Mail said Diddy represented a visual health bar, as well as making the player not feel alone on their journey. As the series progressed, Player 2 became more integral to the gameplay than just soaking up a hit. During development of Donkey Kong Country 2, many names were brainstormed for its potential title. Possible names ranged from Diddy Kong Country and Kremling's The New Batch, to Diddy Kong in Space, even though he's not, and Diddy's Quest for a decent name for his game. The final title became Diddy's Conquest, a pun on the term conquest that also referenced Diddy stepping into the limelight. Many fans mistakenly refer to it as Diddy Kong's Quest, though early footage of the game shows it did take on that title for a short time. Diddy's character design was still receiving some tweaks even at this point. Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto and some of his staff sent sketches of logo ideas for Diddy and Dixie's hats, though Rare used none of them. Instead, they inscribed the Nintendo logo on Diddy's hat and gave a Rare pin to Dixie. Though Dixie's pin disappeared after Rare was sold to Microsoft, the Nintendo branding has stuck with Diddy to this day. This game also marked the debut of the yellow star pattern on Diddy's shirt, though these changes wouldn't be seen in-game until the Nintendo 64 era. Speaking of the N64, Diddy Kong Racing wasn't a Diddy-centered game until very late in development. In the months leading to its release, the game was known as Pro-Am 64, an indirect update to the RC Pro-Am series that featured Timber the Tiger in the lead role. Banjo-Kazooie was planned to be Rare's big holiday title for 1997, but was delayed to the following summer to reach its full potential. This left Rare in a bit of a bind. Suddenly Pro-Am was their Christmas game, and they weren't sure if the brand was strong enough to grab people's attention. The team decided to rebrand the game using Diddy Kong, though Nintendo gave them the choice to pick either Diddy or Donkey Kong for the lead role. In an interview with Nintendo Life, artist Lee Musgrave said, "Nintendo enjoyed the fact that we chose Diddy Kong over Donkey Kong. I think that it was us trying to build on the fact that Diddy was ours and DK was theirs. The team then changed a few things around to attach it to the new IP better, with Musgrave admitting it was a bit of a rush job." Having little competition in its release window, Diddy Kong Racing was the center of attention for Nintendo's marketing. It sold nearly 5 million copies and stands as one of the top 10 best-selling games for the N64. There were several attempts to create a follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing, with each one failing to release as intended, if at all. Following Rare's sale to Microsoft, Diddy Kong Pilot was retooled to Banjo Pilot, and Donkey Kong Racing was cancelled outright. Later, around April 2004, Studio Climax created a GameCube pitch called Diddy Kong Racing Adventure, a project that wasn't publicly known until November 2016, when gaming archivist Andrew Borman obtained the prototype and published a video on it. Like the original, it would have featured an adventure mode complete with boss battles and multiple vehicle choices. A roster of 14 was planned, and Climax hoped to use the existing cast plus characters from Banjo-Kazooie and Conker. In the event a character was unavailable, a Kong family member would take their place. Each character would have also had their own special moves, such as Timber unleashing a Sonic Wave roar attack and Tip-Top using a ring of turtle shells. Other proposed features included weather plus day and night settings, several multiplayer modes, and the ability to change vehicles mid-race, an idea similar to Donkey Kong Racing's animal mechanic. The prototype was shown to Nintendo, but they passed on it. One likely reason is that the rights to Diddy Kong Racing are split between Nintendo and Rare, and it may have been seen as too much of a legal hassle. Diddy made his debut in the Mario series with Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. He only started appearing in non-Rare Nintendo games after the two companies parted ways, further showing that despite Nintendo's ownership, Diddy was treated as a Rare property. Before then, Donkey Kong Jr. would appear in spin-off games, and it may have stayed that way had Rare not left. Early icons from Mario Kart Double Dash reveal that Jr. was planned for the game before Diddy took his place. Diddy also didn't have his own trophy in Super Smash Bros. Melee, whereas Jr. did, as well as Dixie Kong and King K. Rool. Diddy would later become part of the Smash series, starting with Brawl, making him the first and only Western character to be playable as of Smash Wii U and 3DS. During Rare's time with Donkey Kong, programmer Chris Sutherland provided the voice for Diddy. His samples were reused in several later games, with the most recent being Mario Golf World Tour for 3DS, where they were used alongside Diddy's current voice, Katsumi Suzuki. Diddy Kong is also playable in more Donkey Kong Country games than Donkey Kong himself has been. Did you know? The Kremlings weren't originally made for Donkey Kong Country. They were instead created for an unreleased Rare title called Johnny Blastoff and the Kremling Armada. This was a pirate-themed point-and-click adventure game with a tropical setting. Not much work was done on the title, but several of its elements made their way into Donkey Kong Country. It was previously thought that the Kremlings were originally made for a Battletoads game, though in 2015, Rare veteran Greg Mayles, who served as a designer for both Battletoads and Donkey Kong, clarified that Battletoads only served as inspiration for their look. Starting in September that same year, Mayles began to share development material from Donkey Kong Country, giving more insight on the Kremlings. Mayles said he had a soft spot for making bad guys that are slightly pathetic, and that crocodiles were a prime candidate for comical villains. Even so, K. Rool and the Kremlings went through a few revisions before this idea was fully realized. During the game's pre-production stage, they took on a more serious military theme, with some Kremling soldiers using weapons like grenades, bazookas, bayonets, and throwing knives. This concept was ultimately dropped, though some elements still appear in the final game, namely with the enemies Clump and Krusha. At this time, the Kremling leader was known as Crud, sporting a more intimidating design by Rare artist James Ryman. According to a naming sheet dating back to March 8, 1994, the character later took on the name Commander K. Rool. It's possible this name was even alluded to in the final game's fake credits, where K. Rool is credited under the title of Commander. K. Rool's final design was done done by Greg Mails' brother, Steve Mails, with Greg himself supplying the final name as well as the layout for his boss fight. While K. Rool's name is an obvious pun on the word cruel, it's never been stated as to what the K initials stood for. Greg had said the K doesn't stand for anything and was just to form the pun. He also said it was a way of making the character seem more important than he actually was, and it seemed like something K. Rool would do to his name to inflate his own ego. He also jokingly claimed that had he spent more than 5 minutes thinking of a name, he might have come up with something better. Steve Mails recalled that during Donkey Kong Country's development, there were a few hiccups implementing K. Rool into the game. In a Twitter post, he poked fun at Rare programmer Chris Sutherland, who complained about K. Rool being too big. K. Rool's size meant that each frame of animation ate up a lot of memory. Funnily enough, Sutherland would go on to provide the voice for K. Rool for Donkey Kong 64 a few years later, and his samples were later reused for the country ports on Game Boy Advance. A recurring theme for K. Rool is his attempts at stealing the Kong's banana horde, though his motivations have never been very clear. Greg said the game's team never gave much thought about why he'd want to steal the horde, and it was simply used as an excuse for the Kongs to go after him. The question was even posed to Rare directly on their website, where fans could send in questions and comments to be replied by Lee Loveday, a veteran writer at Rare who also wrote dialogue for the country games. In an edition of the Rare blog Scribes published on August 25th, 1999, a fan asked why K. Rool would want to steal the horde, and Loveday gave two possible reasons. Loveday said it was either because K. Rool loves bananas, or because he wants Donkey Kong to starve to death so he can then occupy his cozy treehouse. The former theory is backed up in Donkey Kong Country's instruction manual, which says the Kremlings stole the bananas for their tastiness and nutritional value. However, this was later refuted in the game DK Jungle Climber, where K. Rool states that he hates bananas with a passion. K. Rool has successfully stolen the banana horde a total of 3 times, once in Donkey Kong Country, once in DK64, and once in the Game Boy title Donkey Kong Land. What makes this attempt the most interesting is the fact that it was staged between K. Rool and Cranky Kong, as noted in the instruction manual. The game's story has Cranky make a bet with Donkey and Diddy, saying that after their first victory against K. Rool, he's certain they couldn't do it again on a less powerful 8-bit console. After they take the bait, Cranky calls up K. Rool and arranges for him to steal the horde overnight. King K. Rool's design has gone through several changes over the years. In earlier games, his chest and underbelly had a golden texture, and designer Steve Mails confirmed this was meant to be armor, though in most games, starting with 2005's DK King of Swing, it was changed to appear more like flesh. K. Rool's tail also fluctuates from game to game as well, sometimes being long to being extremely short to occasionally not being there at all. K. Rool's also well known for changing his persona every now and then. Throughout the original Country trilogy, he went under 3 different aliases: King K. Rool in the first game, Captain K. Rool in the second, and Baron K. Roolenstein in the third. In Donkey Kong 64, Cranky mentions in the game's manual that K. Rool gave up on disguises this time around, though for his boss fight he adopts the ring name King Crusher K. Rool. The Captain disguise is also referenced in this game, as pictures of Captain K. Rool appear in some of the sunken ships in the Gloomy Galleon level, as well as in a few cabins in Crystal Caves and the museum found in Creepy Castle. This disguise was also a source of some notable misinformation. In Smash Bros. Brawl, K. Rool's trophy description states Captain K. Rool isn't an alter ego of the king, but rather a different character altogether, said to be K. Rool's brother, with the Japanese version specifying the captain as the older of the two. Rumors claimed this was because K. Rool's disguises are treated as separate characters in Japan, but that isn't the case. In the Game Boy Advance version of Donkey Kong Country 2, the game's intro cutscene confirms the two are one and the same. False family connections to K. Rool have been made before this incident. In the Japanese version of DK64, the character K. Lumsy is said to be K. Rool's younger brother, yet they have no relation in any other version of the game. At the end of Country 3, K. Rool claims to be married. He says that his Chaos robot had been assembled from his wife's best pots and pans, and after being destroyed says, "My wife's going to kill me." Some fans questioned whether the line should be considered canon, though in December 1999, Loveday confirmed this line was only a joke. He said it was just a one-off reference to the British comedy duo Vic and Bob, more specifically from their show The Smell of Reeves and Mortimer, where the line was one of the characters' catchphrases. Funnily enough, Donkey Konga's depiction of K. Rool shows him with a ring on his middle finger, possibly in reference to this line. After his appearance in Mario Super Sluggers for Wii in 2008, K. Rool took a long leave of absence from the gaming landscape. When Donkey Kong Country Returns was first shown off in 2010, one of the questions on people's minds was if the Kremlings and their leader would return as well. When gaming outlet IGN spoke to developer Retro Studios about Returns, they simply said there would be no crocodiles in the game. In an interview with Game Trailers during that year's E3, producer Kensuke Tanabe explained the reason behind their exclusion. Tanabe said, "This is something we actually talked about fairly early on with Miyamoto-san, and we were getting together and we're like, what are we gonna do about King K. Rool? Is he coming back? And we thought about it and said, well, does he really need to? Why don't we just come up with something completely new, and this time make sure there are no crocodiles in there." With the game's sequel, Tropical Freeze, in 2014, another new set of enemies were introduced in the Snowmads, led by Lord Frederick. Fans were quick to compare this character with K. Rool, as his boss fight is essentially an homage to both the character and several fights across the original Country trilogy. Frederick's charge and jump attacks are similar to K. Rool's from Country 1, and his attack where he fires ice dragons from his horn parallels Captain K. Rool's blunderbuss from Country 2, alongside K. Rool's cannonball attack. And the segments where the player attacks him from the background is similar to the rematch against Baron K. Roolenstein in Country 3. It was clear that K. Rool was still on the minds of certain circles within Nintendo, though the character would remain unused for the next few years outside of minor cameos and references. In Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS, he appears as a trophy and as a costume for the Mii Brawler, and in Mario Odyssey's New Donk City, many locales are named after various Donkey Kong characters, with one of the streets being named K. Rool Avenue. The King made his grand return as a playable fighter in 2018 Smash Bros. Ultimate, marking his first physical appearance in a decade. K. Rool is the third character in the Smash roster to have been created outside Japan, following in line with Rare's own Diddy Kong and Retro Studios' Dark Samus. Smash director Masahiro Sakurai said his inclusion was due to his immense popularity in the Super Smash Bros. Fighter ballot. During this window of voting, fans used the hashtags BringBackKRool and CrocTheVote to have their passion for the character heard far and wide. After the announcement of K. Rool's return, the Twitter handle Kremlin Campaigner begun another fan-driven project. A letter signed by thousands of fans was sent to Nintendo in the hopes it would reach Sakurai, thanking him for his devotion to the character. The letter was sent at the end of August 2018, and later that November, Nintendo themselves replied. The letter said it meant the world to see the love for K. Rool, and though Sakurai was too busy to directly respond, Nintendo assured fans he shared the same love for the character that they had shown. Ultimate is also the first game where K. Rool's name is spoken verbally, being pronounced as K. Rool in English and in Japanese as King Cruel. The only other notable time the name was spoken in official media was in the Donkey Kong Country animated series. In the first episode, the name is pronounced both K. Rool and K-Rool, before K. Rool was dropped entirely for the rest of the series. A Twitter user had asked Greg Mails his thoughts on K. Rool's interpretation in the cartoon, to which Greg replied, "Let's just say, I'm not a fan."
Did you know? Early in Metroid Prime's development, the three main villains were a mind-reading South African, a Luddite cult leader, and a neo-Nazi eugenicist. If you've ever looked into Metroid Prime's development, you might have heard it grew out of an earlier project called Action Adventure. To get the inside scoop, we spoke with 7 Metroid Prime team members for this video, including the original lead developer John Whitmore, who told us the Action Adventure game was actually called Metaforce. Metaforce starred 3 hot metahumans who Retro decided to make female, because in the late 90s the mindset was that if a game was third person, players would rather stare at 3 hot chicks from behind than 3 dudes. The neo-Nazi eugenicist wanted to steal their DNA and use it to make a beautiful master race, and this bizarre female-led adventure was the egg that Metroid Prime hatched from, thanks in no small part to Shigeru Miyamoto. In 1999, John and his team at Retro Studios created over 1,000 pages of design documents detailing a futuristic society where gene editing created a utopia, but dark forces were using the technology for evil. It was up to the 3 female protagonists to stop them and save the world, and this trio were called the Metaforce, each with a different playstyle. Bryn was a cybernetic girl who specialized in firearms, Miko was a ninja with psychic abilities, and the third woman was a rifle-wielding dueling assassin. The game would have been around 30 hours in length across 3 acts, each with their own primary antagonist. The first act centered around a Luddite cult leader in India. This cult created a race of 4-armed mutants that carried 4 guns at a time and served as the cult's foot soldiers. The Luddite cult were actually terrorists, running around sabotaging everything they could, including a Jurassic Park-style zoo. Here's John describing a section of Chapter 1.
We had re-engineered mammoths, they were basically this carrying this re-engineered mammoth to the zoo in an armored car or whatever, and he blows up the caravan and lets the mammoth loose, and the mammoth is rampaging through the city, destroying stuff, and you've got to deal with the bad guys, but then also the mammoth that's running around destroying things too. That was a really cool mission.
Chapter 2 focused on the aforementioned neo-Nazi eugenicist who wanted to steal the Metaforce's genes, and as for the villain of the third and final act, John told us,
he was a mind-controlling South African, and he was kind of behind the whole thing. So he had been funding the terrorists and basically getting the neo-Nazi to stir up trouble so he could do things elsewhere. It was, like I said, a really neat plot. I really liked,
Nintendo was part owner of Retro and loved the direction the game was taking, but thought maybe 3 playable characters was too ambitious, so John's team whittled it down to just 1. Bryn, the gun-wielding cybernetic chick. Nintendo also thought third-person cameras were pretty tricky to implement back in those days, so they told Retro to switch the game to first-person. After those changes were implemented was when Miyamoto got involved, who also liked the game's direction, but thought Bryn was too generic, and asked them to come up with a cooler main character. So Retro swapped her out with an alien with sonic abilities that let her see enemies through walls, and wrote another 1,000 pages of design documents. The protagonist alien was discovered by the US government in a UFO crash, then turned into a federal agent to help them fight off an invasion by another race of aliens, who were evil. Eventually, Miyamoto said something along the lines of, "You know what? These enemy aliens would make great space pirates. How would y'all like to turn this into a Metroid game?" John's team thought that sounded great, so they played through all the Metroid games over and over, watched hours of speedruns, read every forum post they could find, and wrote another 1,000 pages of design documents. By then, it had become a running joke at Retro that once a game hit 1,000 pages, it was definitely gonna get cancelled. At this point, Retro had no idea what the GameCube was going to look like or what kind of hardware was under the hood. They were initially told it would be a lot more powerful, and Nintendo showed them some GameCube prototypes, one of which looked like a transparent PlayStation 2. They also said it would essentially have a PS2 DualShock controller, so Retro planned for Metroid Prime to have traditional FPS controls where the right stick handles movement and the left stick adjusts the view. Retro thought it all sounded awesome, but one day Nintendo showed up with the finalized hardware, a purple lunchbox and a controller that John told us looked like it could only be used for Miyamoto games.
Look, the GameCube, it's not even a cube, so that's a problem for me just with my OCD. Like, if you're gonna call something a cube, make it a cube at least. But I don't like my Play School version, my first video game Play School console look that it had. Wasn't a big fan.
Here's James H. Dargy, who also worked on Metaforce and stayed on board till Metroid Prime shipped. Already exhausted from all his team's work that had thus far gotten thrown in the trash, the weaker and kiddier GameCube was the last straw for John. He pretty much immediately quit and found a new job elsewhere, and when Metroid Prime launched a year later, they left him out of the credits. That's the short version of the story, but there were a few more twists and turns, like switching back to third person, then back again to first person. But now you know how the gene-stealing third-person adventure with 3 female leads gradually evolved into a first-person game starring a single heroine fighting against aliens. So let's check out some of the game's other history. Before coming to Retro, James H. Dargy also worked on ships featured in The Matrix and Final Fantasy Spirits Within, so Nintendo told him for Samus's ship, he could, quote, do anything. He went through a number of iterations, but what he ended up with was the ship we know today, a vessel with lots of sci-fi inspirations, but mostly the ship from Super Metroid and Star Wars' Millennium Falcon. He showed us his model of Samus's ship, and told us as an homage to the Millennium Falcon, he added these guns to the bottom, which you never actually see in-game, but they are there. Even if you don't get to see the guns firing, you can still see the panels that conceal them. Samus's ship in Metroid Prime isn't the same ship from the mainline series. It was designed and modeled entirely by James. Fans usually refer to all Samus's ships collectively as the gunship, even though none of them actually have names. But James told us he named the ship in Metroid Prime the Thrush Eterna, inspired by a fast-flying bird called a thrush. According to James, Samus's ship never really had a name. I've designed a few different spaceships, and I've written lore and backstory for different games, and even for film. You know, I'm a big fan of sci-fi in general, so I think cool ships should have cool names, and that's the name I came up with. It was kind of bird-like, and I wanted it to be cool, like eternal. Maybe it existed long before Samus ever got it. The name Thrush Eterna implies backstory. He went on to say that files at the top-level directory were called Thrush Eterna, but the ship's name never actually appears in the game's script.
Maybe it was more mysterious to leave it the ship with no name, you know? Maybe.
We also spoke with Metroid Prime's audio lead, Clark Wen, who filled us in on the audio history and sound secrets.
Yeah, there's one Easter egg I think the fans might be curious to know about, because I've never told anyone, and you have to be a bit of a film fan to understand it.
The Easter egg he's talking about can be found in the save room fanfare. There's a tone you'll hear right after saving or when you load your save file. Clark told us this audio Easter egg comes from the 1971 film Walkabout, which he was obsessed with and watched over and over during Prime's development. To quickly summarize without giving away any spoilers, the movie's about a father who drives his two children into the Australian wilderness, then has a mental breakdown and sets the car on fire, then shoots himself. So his two kids are left with no choice but to wander the outback trying to find their way to civilization. The movie has heavy themes of survival and isolation, along with some otherworldly soundscapes, all of which Clark wanted to emulate in Metroid Prime. The entire game has an audio vibe inspired by the film, but the save room fanfare is a direct reference to the scene in Walkabout where the kids survive their first nightfall, drenched in one of the film's soundscapes. Here it is. That's the Easter egg in Prime's save room fanfare. Did you catch it? Here's them side by side for comparison. It's a pretty pessimistic film, but Clark shared some more lighthearted sound stories as well, like the sounds puddle spores make are actually Metroid Prime's developers burping and belching. He told us, the sounds of the puddle spore creatures that appear in the Magmoor Caverns area were made using the thickest, wettest burps I could wrangle from my fellow retro employees. I sent a company-wide email asking for volunteers who could belch on cue. Afterwards, to my surprise, I literally had a line of people waiting outside the VO booth. That was a fun day of recording. He ended up using 4 of those belches in the final game, after using some distortions, of course. According to Clark, Metroid Prime's space pirates actually speak a real human language. Well, kind of. He told us, I wanted the pirates to sound kind of semi-intelligent. Instead of using animal sounds and roars, I wanted them to have some kind of language. So I took Russian words and kind of flipped around the syllables and assigned them to different actions. So for example, when they attack the player, that was using the Russian word for attack, then just moving some of the syllables around. I got someone in the studio to record them, then we put them in the game. But it sounded like we had Russian mafia yelling something in Slavic. Clark wasn't satisfied with the Russian mafia vibe, so he scrapped the audio and replaced it with pit bull noises, but in playtesting, the staff thought it sounded cartoony and dumb, so he threw that out as well. Clark's third attempt is what made it into the final game. One of Retro's programmers was Nigerian and spoke a language called Yoruba, so just like earlier with Russian, Clark had him take the Yoruba words like attack and mixed up the syllables, recorded his voice, and distorted it. And that's the language the space pirates speak in the final game. Clark also wanted to use his own voice for the tangleweeds. He was running short on time, so rather than trying to find a proper sound effect, he just made the sound with his own mouth. He told us, those sounds are actually my voice pitch shifted up an octave, and the only time I used my voice anywhere in Prime. After some head-scratching remarks from Nintendo over the years, there's been confusion among fans whether or not the Prime series is part of mainline canon, or if it's part of its own separate canon. According to series producer Yoshio Sakamoto, he thought about making Prime separate, what he calls a gaiden, but ultimately decided it was best to insert it into the mainline canon between Metroid 1 and 2. When we talked to John Whitmore, he said his team actually did think they were making a gaiden. He told us, "We were considering it as just kind of a reboot of Metroid, without much historical reference to the past games. Or at least I think it was basically, Nintendo will kind of figure this out for us after the fact. We wanted to use enemies from the previous games, so there was some sense that this was building on what happened in previous games. But like I said, we were looking at it as more of a reboot, rather than as something connected to a history of the franchise. So even though Metroid Prime was developed as a reboot, or gaiden, Nintendo ultimately decided to insert it into the timeline after Metroid 1. The titular Metroids were one of the returning enemies Retro wanted to appear in the game, so really it was the only place Nintendo could insert Prime into the timeline, since Samus drove Metroids to extinction in Metroid 2. Well, except the baby, of course. John also told us Metroid Fusion wasn't originally part of Nintendo's master plan. He said it was common knowledge that Miyamoto was willing to take the risk with Retro, who'd never even completed a single game before, making a new Metroid because it wasn't a franchise Miyamoto created himself. And to quote John directly, Miyamoto didn't care if we killed it. Previous Metroid games sold pretty poorly, especially in Japan, but Prime took the world by storm when it was revealed at Space World 2000. John says Nintendo was really surprised when those early trailers generated massive hype, especially in the West, and it was the hype for Prime that directly led Nintendo starting development on Fusion, a companion game for Game Boy Advance that launched the exact same day as Metroid Prime. John told us, "I don't think Nintendo had any idea how big Metroid was gonna be. Like I said, it wasn't Miyamoto's favorite game, and it was kinda dormant among Nintendo franchises for a while. It wasn't until the news came out that they were doing Metroid Prime and people really started talking about it that they said, actually, this is a franchise we overlooked, and realized how much legs it had here in the West. And that's when they decided to do the GBA Metroid game as well. But when we were first working on Metroid Prime, they had no plans for doing anything like that. It was the buzz that was continually being generated about Metroid that got them to inject something else into the franchise. But even if Miyamoto was willing to risk Metroid's death at the hands of an unproven studio, he still brought his A-game and was instrumental in the game's success. Retro spent the first 3 months developing Metroid Prime as a third-person adventure, but Miyamoto upended the tea-table and made them change it to first-person. Some areas had to be changed or thrown out entirely, like this vertical platforming section that simply wouldn't work in first-person. Even Sakamoto and Retro's president Jeff Spangenberg wanted 3D Metroid to be in third person, and the battle over perspectives was one of the main reasons John Whitmore resigned as head of the project. And John says although Miyamoto won the war, the guys at Retro still snuck in as many chances to switch to third person as they could to show off the Samus model they designed, like in save rooms and cutscenes. But looking back on it all now, 2 decades later, John admits Miyamoto was absolutely right to make the game in first person. Very late in development, Miyamoto also remapped the game's buttons himself, which made controlling Samus a lot more intuitive, and as a result, made the game a whole lot better. James told us, Miyamoto changed the idea of how it should function, like this button being lock on and this button turning the camera and how it works. We had it just a little different, but it never quite felt natural.
Like you got used to it and it was like, oh yeah, like once you understand it, it's functional, but you know, he had suggested a different approach and it was much more intuitive, and that was only after like 15 minutes of playing with it. You know, he knows he's good at his job. I guess he's a good, he's one of those real geniuses.
We also got in touch with Jim Warnell, the Nintendo of America artist who made Metroid Prime's logo. He told us the logo went through 53 iterations, which based on all the man-hours that went into it, made it the most expensive logo Nintendo ever produced. Different colors, different fonts, different designs, and after 53 different versions, this is what he ended up with. Everyone loved it, so Jim was later tasked with making the logos for Metroid Fusion, Prime 2, and Metroid Prime Hunters. Speaking of which, all these games had completely different box art in Japan, but still used Jim's logo designs. He didn't do the logos for Prime 3 or Zero Mission though, which is why their designs are noticeably different. They're basically just stylized text. Speaking of Metroid Prime 3, did you know it was almost an open world game where Samus was an actual bounty hunter? As in, she would have gone on side quests hunting down baddies and hauling them in for a reward. We spoke with Brian Walker, the senior producer of Prime 2 and 3, and also the guy who convinced Nintendo to let them remaster the entire trilogy and release it for the price of only one Wii game. He left Retro Studios a few years ago after finishing the trilogy, and from his home in the countryside of Austin, Texas, he told us one big development story. After wrapping up development on Prime 2, Brian and his team were feeling a little burnt out on the franchise, so they looked through Nintendo's collection of IP to consider what they wanted to work on next. They created design documents for potential Wii games and pitched them to Nintendo. One of them was a revival of Donkey Kong Country, and another was a Zelda spin-off where you played as the last surviving Sheikah after your race was wiped out in a genocidal ethnic cleansing. Retro's pitches were forwarded to Nintendo President Satoru Iwata, who came back and said before Retro branched out into new IP, he wanted them to make the Prime series a proper trilogy. The Wii hadn't released yet, and Iwata wanted a new Metroid Prime that could show off the capabilities of their new home console and the potential of its revolutionary new controller. So Retro agreed. They'd go bananas with Donkey Kong later, but first, they'd make Metroid Prime 3. So they got to work brainstorming what Samus's jump into the next console generation was gonna look like, and what they came up with was open-world bounty hunting. Brian knows what kinds of ideas might conjure up in the imaginations of modern gamers, and he's seen some over-exuberant fans spreading wild exaggerations of Retro's concept since he briefly mentioned it on the excellent Kiwi Talks podcast. But to get the full and accurate story out to the fanbase, Brian asked us to help set the record straight with this video. He told us, "We were not proposing in any way, shape, or form, even in our wildest dreams, that we would have like Metroid Prime Skyrim. We were not talking about 200-hour side quests or anything like that. More precisely, it was the ability for the player to operate out of a hub area, and to go on to different missions that didn't necessarily lend themselves directly to the normal path progression that a Metroid Prime game was known for, as far as traversal, retroversal, and so forth. Samus had the ability to step outside of that and do more things on the side. Brian and a lot of the other guys at Retro Studios had always imagined Samus as someone like Boba Fett, but with a sense of honor. For the non-Star Wars fans out there, Boba Fett's an intergalactic bounty hunter with a decades-long career hunting down heads for cash, probably most famous for capturing Han Solo at the behest of Jabba the Hutt. As such, most of the optional side quests in Metroid Prime 3 would have consisted of bounty hunting missions, with Samus leaving the game's main campaign to fly around the galaxy, chasing down baddies of various types. Retro didn't plan on implementing an in-game currency. Instead, Samus's reward would have been gaining additional capabilities. To quote Brian directly, "I recall the ability for the player to, for lack of a better term, applying the JRPG term here, to level up by going off to do some side quests instead of following the scripted storyline, so to speak." So that was a key consideration, and that's a well-established convention in a variety of games. And it wasn't just Samus. Her ship would have grown stronger as well. In fact, making the ship more central to gameplay was one of Retro's primary goals for wrapping up the trilogy. The game's director Mark Pacini built a 10-inch origami replica of Samus's ship and brought it into their production meetings, using it as something of a mascot for the game's production. When we asked whatever happened to that origami ship, Brian said he thinks Mark Pacini probably still has it tucked away somewhere.
He should auction that off on eBay after all the exposure it's getting here. We could probably raise some good funds for charity with it. Hey, no pressure, Mark. Cough it up.
Hopefully that'll happen someday and we'll all get a chance to see it. While discussing how Samus's ship would have worked in-game, Brian was quick to explain that Retro never planned to let players actively fly the ship. He told us, "The thing we should clarify is that we're not talking about flying the ship first person like Wing Commander. That wouldn't really have fit in with the Metroid Prime formula. It was just something we felt like if you couldn't do it right, if you couldn't make something state-of-the-art, don't try to do it halfway. So a watered-down Wing Commander approach just wasn't gonna fly, no pun intended. Rather than the player flying the ship directly, it would have served as an extension of Samus's abilities in the overworld. Retro prototyped several abilities, like calling in the ship to serve as a distraction, drawing enemy fire away from Samus so she'd have an easier time clearing them out. But only 2 of these abilities made it into the final game. ship missiles that would let you call in a bombing run, and the grapple beam for moving large objects, neither of which were used all too frequently. Overall, the ship was just meant to play a larger role and be a more applicable tool in Samus's repertoire as she explored the game world. Brian's immensely proud of how the game turned out, but laments the limited ship functionality in the game's final build, feeling they ended up short of their original goals. So why didn't open world bounty hunting become a reality? Retro took their design docs and pitched the concept to Nintendo in a high-level presentation. They wanted to expand on the Boba Fett aspects of Samus's character, but it turned out Nintendo had a completely different understanding of who and what Samus really is. As Brian remembers it, Kiyo, who was one of the translators, boiled it down very well in the assumption that our Japanese partners had of Samus, that she was not doing it for the money, she was being very altruistic, and I think he rolled out the term motherly. She was caring for people. What she was doing was literally out of the goodness of her heart, because she deeply cared about humanity, which was as far away from Boba Fett as you can get. I never would have equated Samus with the definition of an altruistic motherly influence, given that she had the title of bounty hunter. We were just looking at Kiyo as he was describing this like, are we even on the same planet? Retro was genuinely confused why Nintendo was so resistant to the bounty hunting mission structure they were proposing, until after several days of discussion they realized Nintendo didn't actually know what a bounty hunter really was. They'd been calling Samus a bounty hunter since 1986, but apparently they thought of her more as a space adventurer with a heart of gold. A space adventurer that definitely didn't hunt bounties. And ultimately, that contradiction between Retro and Nintendo's understanding of Samus's character was why the open world concept got killed off. But there were also some practical concerns. Retro Studios was a lean, mean Metroid Prime developing team with only 45 devs. As Brian describes it, they were hardwired and staffed to make that finely crafted and balanced experience of the first two Metroid Primes. But to do something much different outside of that would have been a pretty significant staffing and development push. It was outside of the very tightly scripted, very carefully crafted experience of discovery and isolation that really are the fundamentals of the Metroid experience, not only in Prime but the 2D games as well. Some of us had worked on other types of games that had these kind of sandbox considerations, and we were pointing out the amount of work to do something even close to competent in that area was significant. We trusted Nintendo at the end of the day. We trusted their instincts and their judgment. They're the best in the business for a reason. They have a long track record of making the right call. In the end, they decided to stay the course and develop Prime 3 with a similar formula to the first two games, although Brian says he would have loved to see what fans thought of the more open-world format. To be clear, that game isn't in a vault somewhere, and outside of the ship's functions, Retro's ideas only existed as documents pitched to Nintendo, and it was one of many rejected pitches Brian's been involved with in his 30-year career. But who knows? With Retro Studios back in the saddle with Metroid Prime 4, maybe someday we'll get to see that vision become a reality.
Did you know? There's a Japan-only Metroid game full of exclusive lore and had several of its story elements reused in Metroid Fusion, Zero Mission, Super Metroid, and even Metroid Prime 2? Well, kind of. Released a few months after the original Famicom Disk System game, Metroid Zebes Invasion Order was an interactive literary adaptation licensed by Nintendo and published by Futushaba in December 1986. It's sort of like a choose-your-own-adventure novel on steroids, where the reader, or more accurately the player, is constantly making choices and rolling dice, then flipping to specific pages to explore branching paths, a bit like Dungeons & Dragons. As such, this gamebook borrows many elements from tabletop RPGs, like having to use pencil and paper to keep track of Samus's health, missile count, and current location in Zebes' labyrinthian underworld. The first 3 quarters of the story follows the original Metroid pretty faithfully, but the final act strikes out and forges its own path, and interestingly, seems to foreshadow events that didn't happen in the mainline series until decades later. These days, buying the book and getting it translated into English would set you back about $2,000, but we're gonna save you the trouble, and at the end of this video, we'll even show you how to play it without spending a penny. Just like the original game, Space Pirates have obtained a capsule of Metroid embryos and taken it to Zebes for experimentation, with the goal of creating a dangerous bioweapon. Samus is tasked with infiltrating Zebes, defeating the Space Pirates, and retrieving the capsule so the Federation can study it. The gameplay has Samus exploring room by room, fighting enemies, collecting new weapons and abilities, and backtracking to previous rooms so she can use those new abilities to access secret rooms and more upgrades. Zebes is made up of 3 areas connected by elevators: Brinstar, Norfair, and Torian, totaling 97 rooms, each represented by one page, and almost every room containing one enemy. To kill enemies, the player rolls a 6-sided die to determine if they kill an enemy or if it damages Samus. If it doesn't die on the first roll, the player keeps rolling until either it or Samus are dead. Using missiles, or more powerful beam upgrades acquired throughout your adventure, gives you better dice rolling odds in combat, and eventually, the Various suit will double Samus's defenses, cutting damage in half. Later in your playthrough, you'll want to backtrack to the beginning to hunt for upgrades, and with a slew of new abilities, Samus makes quick work of enemy types that might have killed her just a few hours earlier, and she can use newly acquired upgrades like bombs to gain access to new areas. Zebus Invasion Order is incredibly difficult, but when Samus dies, she's at least sent back to the beginning of the area she died in with all of her upgrades still intact. The gamebook is surprisingly faithful to the video game, so much so that some Metroid speedrunning strats can be used with the book. Instead of backtracking room by room all the way across the map, sometimes it's easier just to die on purpose and get sent back to the start of an area, which is known as a death warp in speedrunning. Keeping track of Samus's health, missiles, and the map can grow tiresome, but the Metroid formula's conversion into a gamebook is really quite genius. Some decisions stand out as particularly creative adaptations of the video game's core mechanics. For example, sometimes you'll come across a room with a secret entrance to a hidden room. To access it, you'll need to flip to the page in the book that represents the hidden room, but the page itself is also hidden. You're told the page number, but with one digit missing, so you'll have to hunt through the book to find it. And you're usually well compensated when you do, with the secret rooms having some of the best items like missile expansions, energy tanks, and the screw attack. Up to this point, Zebus Invasion Order mirrors the Famicom Disk System title, but with a few notable differences. In the game, Zebus is a planet, but the gamebook refers to Zebus as an asteroid. A little extra lore was added as well, like how Mother Brain's been experimenting on Zebus's indigenous creatures and grafting cybernetic enhancements onto them. The book also expands on Ridley's abilities, giving him psychic abilities that accentuate the pain caused by his fire attacks. Creed and Ridley are also holding keystones that are required to unlock the path to Torian, which explains why Samus can't head straight to Mother Brain right from the start. After killing Mother Brain and retrieving the Metroid capsule, Samus climbs out an escape shaft and flies away in her spaceship. At this point, the game changes completely. You're no longer required to keep track of Samus's stats or location, and gameplay shifts into a more traditional choose-your-own-adventure format. The gamebook's story goes down its own path for the final act, adding some extra twists and turns, some of which made their way into future mainline installments. As Samus flees in her ship, she realizes one of the capsule's embryos broke out and developed into a gigantic, mutated Metroid. This new story element was presumably inspired by the end of the 1979 film Alien, where Ripley finds the xenomorph stowed away on her escape pod. Perhaps more interestingly, this was the first time Metroid fans ever got to see a mutated Metroid, and the same could be said for Samus's spaceship. Neither were in the original game, and both made their video game debut 5 years later in Metroid 2: Return of Samus. With the mutant Metroid bearing down on her, the player has two choices: send out a distress signal from the cockpit, or flee in an escape pod. Either way, she's eventually forced to dock in a giant ship belonging to the Space Pirates, in a situation very similar to the extra chapter added to Metroid Zero Mission. However, one major difference is that the gamebook's author depicted the Space Pirates as humans, since they weren't revealed as aliens until 8 years later in Super Metroid. The Space Pirates capture Samus and their boss pulls off her helmet, revealing that, gasp, Samus is a woman! The pirates are all shocked it was actually a woman who destroyed their base on Zebus, and the pirate boss is even, quote, horrified by the revelation. What happens next branches off into 8 different endings. 6 of those endings result in Samus getting killed by either the Metroid or at the hands of the Space Pirates. Of the 2 endings where Samus survives, the bad ending occurs if you try to escape without risking your life to retrieve the capsule and complete your mission. If you make that mistake, you're treated to a conclusion very similar to the end of Metroid Fusion. Samus flees to the docking bay but gets intercepted by the mutant Metroid at the last second, and after she kills it in the equivalent of a final boss battle, she escapes in a small craft and fires a missile that destroys the pirate ship. But as Samus flies into the distance, the mutant Metroid can be seen latched onto her ship, implying she might die off screen soon after. In the good ending, Samus faces off against the pirate boss in a sword fight, culminating in the boss getting killed by Samus or defeated and left to get killed by the mutant. Either way, Samus takes the capsule and escapes on the small craft, fires a missile destroying the pirate ship, and flies off with the Metroid capsule. Mission complete. After it's all said and done, the players treat it to an epilogue where a meteorite lands on Earth, and although nothing's found at the impact crater, several human corpses are found nearby with the life drained from their bodies. It's implied that unbeknownst to the locals, the crashed object was actually the mutant Metroid, who developed a hateful obsession for Samus and came to Earth to hunt her down. A dark and foreboding cliffhanger for a sequel that never got made. Although, it's worth noting, the idea of a heavily mutated Metroid viewing Samus as its arch-nemesis and coming after her again and again later found its way into Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. Zebus Invasion Order features quite a few original plot lines that have influenced future games, but it's unclear if the developers took direct inspiration from the game book, or if all these similarities are just a coincidence. Zebus Invasion Order borrows story beats from the Alien movies, and the same can be said for the video games, so perhaps the parallels are simply the result of a shared inspiration. Regardless, it's interesting to see similar events play out in the book years or even decades before they happen in the games. Copies of Zebus Invasion Order have become increasingly rare and expensive over the past 35 years, to the point where it's hard to find a listing for one at any price. But one fan who was able to get his hands on a copy was Devin Monins, aided in no small part by the Game Preservation Society in Japan. Over the course of several years, Devin translated Zebus Invasion Order and converted it into a playable text adventure. It's now freely available on Metroid Database, so if you want to give it a try, we'll leave a link in this video's description. Devin even streamlined it so the game keeps track of Samus's health, missiles, and the map all on its own, so you don't have to resort to pencil and paper unless you're feeling like a purist. This is actually how we played the game, though the quality of life features were disabled to best replicate the authentic experience of playing the game book.
Did you know? While the Virtual Boy is often considered the brainchild of legendary Japanese designer Gunpei Yokoi, the technology was first created by an American engineer. In 1985, Alan Becker noticed the poor quality of laptop screens and decided to create a small, portable, high-resolution display. He decided to try using an array of light-emitting diodes, or LEDs. The small band of LEDs would change patterns so quickly that they would be seen as a complete image. However, instead of moving the LEDs themselves, Becker would reflect them off an oscillating mirror. Becker named this device the Scanned Linear Array, which was capable of producing a bright, clear image for a low price. The Virtual Boy's signature red color scheme came from the materials Becker had access to at the time. As he lacked the funds to create his own prototype from scratch, he used a cheap red LED array meant for displays on large printers. Becker went on to found Reflection Technology Incorporated in 1986 and developed a miniaturized version of this technology named the Private Eye. When viewed from 18 inches away, the Private Eye's 1-inch display was capable of simulating a 12-inch display. While many companies were interested in the technology, none of them managed to find an application useful enough to pass the experimentation phase. By the early 90s, the tech industry was dominated by the idea of virtual reality. Even NASA had its own research lab dedicated to it. Reflection Technology courted the game and toy industries, attempting to capitalize on the craze. They pitched the Private Eye to Hasbro, Mattel, and Sega, but each company rejected them. It wasn't until 1991 that Reflection finally found a buyer for that technology, Nintendo, who then dominated the games industry. At the time, Gunpei Yokoi felt out of place in gaming, as he thought the medium was too focused on flashy graphics and catering to a hardcore audience. He intended to retire from Nintendo the following year and establish his own company where he had more direct creative control. But then the Private Eye showed up. During Reflection's demonstration of the tech, then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi fell asleep. While this seemed dismissive, it was actually a green light. He was sending the message that his employees could proceed without his supervision, and Nintendo acquired exclusive worldwide video game licensing rights to the technology in 1992. Using the tech, the Virtual Boy was developed by Nintendo Research and Development 1 and went under the working title VR32. Gunpei Yokoi was enthusiastic about the head tracking technology, which would make the console's graphics move with the user's head movements. In fact, VR32 was initially meant to be a pair of wearable goggles. However, Nintendo's engineers were concerned about having a chip that produced high-frequency radio emissions so close to a user's head, as the effects of EMF radiation on the human body were not well understood at the time. The chip also produced a lot of noise. To protect the user from these issues, a metal plate was installed around the CPU. Unfortunately, this made the goggles too heavy to move around. The team also had concerns about motion sickness and risk of injury, and so Nintendo scrapped the idea of head tracking. But that wasn't the end of the console's potential health risks. Reflection encouraged Nintendo to hire Dr. Ellie Pelly of the Scapin's Eye Research Institute to determine whether the console was harmful to the eyes. Pelly found that the console was harmless, with one exception. If a child around the ages of 5 and 7 were to play a system with both displays misaligned, they could develop lazy eye. Nintendo used rigid materials to ensure this wouldn't happen. While the problem was solved, new product liability laws forced Nintendo's hand, and they included warnings on the packaging that children under 7 should not play the Virtual Boy. They also installed a software timer reminding users to take a break from the console every 15 minutes. While these warnings were precautionary and included for legal reasons, they gave the impression the Virtual Boy was detrimental to people's health. Sensational headlines swept Japan as the console launched. Further problems came from within Nintendo. Sony's PlayStation and the Sega Saturn were due out in 1994, but the Nintendo 64 wouldn't be ready for launch until 1996. Most of Nintendo's money and attention was devoted to the Nintendo 64. As such, the Virtual Boy was pressured to release as soon as possible to bridge the gap in income. Not only that, but Yamauchi instructed Yokoi to de-emphasize Mario and the Virtual Boy so his 3D debut in Super Mario 64 would be all the more impactful. R&D1 attempted to make their own games while also relying on their frequent collaborators' Intelligent Systems to create original software for the console. But both teams lacked the time and resources to create games that really took advantage of the system's unique hardware. Ultimately, the console only had 22 games over the course of its lifespan. Faith in the product plummeted, and even Yokoi expressed doubts about the system. Nintendo faced stiff competition, with Sony and Sega both launching their 32-bit consoles that year. Nintendo had spent a considerable amount of time and money on VR32, even buying a manufacturing plant in China for it. Along with these large expenses, public response to the Virtual Boy was tepid. Fans and critics had been expecting a next-generation powerhouse, and the red and black visuals and toy-like appearance of the console turned many away. While the console was more powerful than the Super NES and Mega Drive, it was also at an extreme disadvantage, as it had to display 2 screens at once. This made it difficult for Nintendo to demonstrate its true power. The system's 3D capabilities were also less than impressive. 3D accelerators were a new technology at the time and couldn't be included in a portable console because they used too much space and power. Even with this energy-conscious design, the machine still took 6 AA batteries to run. Despite these problems, Yamauchi remained confident, boldly proclaiming they would sell 3 million units in Japan alone. Ultimately, the console sold less than 800,000 units worldwide. While Nintendo boasted of being sold out in America, this was only because they shipped an extremely limited number of units. Some stores received as few as 2 systems. Prices dropped rapidly, yet low sales persisted, preventing the chance of a European release. There were a number of contributing factors to the public's disinterest: a lack of software, a reputation to cause eye strain, back strain, and headaches, a lack of portability, and the antisocial nature of the hardware itself. The name Virtual Boy drew unfavorable comparisons with the wildly successful Game Boy. Miyamoto would later say that Nintendo gave mixed signals to consumers by developing 2 consoles simultaneously, both marketed on their 3D capabilities. The Nintendo 64 used revolutionary 3D technology, whereas the Virtual Boy was iterative, using established technology but with a 3D display. Some developers did praise the console, however. Steve Wota, who worked on Ocean's Waterworld, considered it a great piece of technology and felt it could have reached its full potential given a couple of years. Miyamoto felt it wasn't that the Virtual Boy was a failure, but that it was marketed in a poor light. In an Iwata Asks interview, he said, "When you think of it as a game console, selling 100,000 units is just a start. But if you think of it as a fun toy, it's a big success if you break just 50,000. Viewed like that, it was, I think, quite an appealing toy. When you think of it as a gaming platform, it becomes a failure." Rumors suggested Yokoi became an outcast within Nintendo following the console's launch and that he resigned as a result, but he intended to leave the company even before the Virtual Boy began development. Yokoi took responsibility for the failure of the console by designing Nintendo's next successful portable venture, the Game Boy Pocket, before leaving in August 1996. His profound impact on the gaming industry was not damaged by the Virtual Boy, and upon his departure, Nintendo lost shares so rapidly the Tokyo Stock Exchange exchange had to cease operations. The late Nintendo president Satoru Iwata said that after the Virtual Boy's failure, it would have been understandable for Nintendo to shy away from 3D technology. However, the company continued to pursue the concept, encouraged by Yamauchi and Miyamoto's enthusiasm for it. A working prototype of the 3DS's technology was functioning as early as the Game Boy Advance SP. Additionally, the GameCube had 3D compatibility built into the system, but it required an expensive LCD that would far exceed the price of the console itself. Iwata felt at the time of the 3DS's release that Nintendo had achieved the fruition of its many attempts of a 3D-capable console. The Virtual Boy has been referenced in a lot of Nintendo games following its release. The console appears in the background of the trophy room in Super Smash Bros. Melee if the player sets the language to Japanese in the NTSC version. It can be spotted in the background of Francis's room in Super Paper Mario, as well as 9Volt's stage in WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro games. A Virtual Boy can also be obtained in Animal Crossing New Leaf, Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, Pokemon Stadium 2, and Mii Plaza. It can even be found in Tamagotchi Life, and was prominently featured in the game's Nintendo Direct. The console is also referenced outside of Nintendo games. A modified Virtual Boy is used in the manga Ai ga Tomaranai. An ad for the console can be seen in the background of the Simpsons game. Additionally, a VB mode can be unlocked in the Game Boy Advance version of Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. Activating this mode will turn the whole screen red. The Virtual Boy's failure appears to have influenced Nintendo's approach to VR even to this day. In an interview with Bloomberg in 2016, then president of Nintendo America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, claimed Nintendo wanted to ensure virtual reality represents strong value to the consumer before pursuing it again. He said a mainstream mass-market application of VR technology was perhaps further away than some anticipated. Nintendo was willing to go ahead with VR, but only after players could use the technology for hours on end without problems. However, they appear to still be experimenting. A tentative step towards VR came from Nintendo Labo. Compatible modes were built into Super Mario Odyssey and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and more recently, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate.
Did you know? The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Switch had been successfully emulated on a PC before the game even released in the USA. Using an Australian dump of the game's files, developers of the Yuzu emulator managed to get the game booting up past the title screen in mere hours. While it's still early days for the emulator, this was no doubt an impressive feat. Besides its already impressive games library, one of the Switch's most defining features are its Joy-Cons. The Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons were originally going to be sold in same color sets, but this was changed when someone at Nintendo accidentally snapped two different color Joy-Cons onto a Switch. General producer of the Nintendo Switch console, Yoshiaki Koizumi, stated, "We actually weren't thinking about having two different colors on the same console at the same time in the beginning. This was until someone slipped on one of each color Joy-Con onto a single console, and suddenly everyone gathered around and said, 'Oh, that looks great.' So at first it was red and red, or blue and blue, but sometimes mistakes happen and they end up being the right mistakes." The Joy-Cons would also originally attach to the console using magnets, but this caused a few issues. Besides the risk of magnets interfering with the system's hardware and Wi-Fi signal, the console itself would often detach from the Joy-Cons and fall onto the lap of whoever was playing it. One relic of this iteration can still be seen in the final console, however. When the magnets attached, they made a snapping sound. This was found to be a very satisfying sound and was implemented with the final Joy-Cons. Nintendo also tried having the Joy-Cons connect to the Switch by attaching them via dish-shaped parts. All in all, around 5 prototype versions of the Switch and Joy-Cons were made before the final form factor was decided on. Joy-Cons were inspired by the Wii Remote, but not just in function. During the Wii era, Nintendo received a lot of feedback from players of Wii Sports and Wii Fit, asking for a smaller version of the remote that could be strapped to the body. Nintendo held on to this feedback and set out to make a smaller controller. Engineers realized a smaller Joy-Con-sized controller could attach to a handheld device, leading to the Switch's main innovation of being a hybrid console. The Switch has interesting secrets surrounding its creation, but it also has several secrets within the system itself. Data miners who dug around the Switch's internal files found some curious details. Lines of code referring to a VR mode were discovered while examining the system's 3.0 update in June 2017. By tinkering with the settings related to the mode, it was found that the Switch had the option for a virtual reality dual display. This was nearly 2 full years before the release of the Nintendo Labo VR kit, which finally made use of stereoscopic 3D. This isn't the only secret within the Switch. In September 2017, an emulator called Flog was found hidden in the system's code. The emulator was programmed to activate only if the system's internal calendar was set to July 11th, at which point it could be used to play the NES game Golf. Golf was one of the first games made by Satoru Iwata when he was working as a programmer, and July 11th was the date he passed away in 2015. In order to actually access the emulator, players would have to hold a Joy-Con in each hand and extend their arms outward, recreating Iwata's signature pose from the Nintendo Direct presentations. In an interview with Kotaku, Nintendo of America's then-president Reggie Fils-Aimé said, "It was identified by folks playing around in the firmware. We've got nothing officially to announce for that content or what the plans are for that content. So that's that. Certainly anything that pays respect to my friend Mr. Iwata is something that is near and dear to me personally, but in terms of that execution and what it was meant to do or what the plans are, we've got nothing to announce." Some Japanese fans likened the presence of the emulator to an omamori, a type of charm often used for protection or good luck. Further data mining found the emulator only worked on Switch systems with older firmware. Eventually, all references to the emulator were removed from the Switch's code as part of the 4.0 system update in December 2017. Another far more bizarre Easter egg was found in the Switch's photo album application. If a player hasn't taken screenshots yet, several demo images can be seen in the album, including one of a man looking at a phone. This particular image bears an uncanny resemblance to a popular Japanese meme. What's bizarre about this is that the original source of the meme is a screenshot from a Japanese adult film called A Midsummer Night's Lewd Dream. This raised eyebrows for many and seems a very strange thing to be referenced in a Nintendo product. The Switch enjoyed great success in the months following its launch, but this wasn't without controversy. In August 2017, tablet developer GameVice filed a lawsuit accusing Nintendo of patent infringement. Previously, GameVice had released a gaming tablet equipped with a detachable controller known as a WikiPad, a design they claimed Nintendo illegally copied with the release of the Switch. The lawsuit asked for both monetary damages as well as a ban on all future sales of the Switch. The case was voluntarily dropped 2 months later, but a second infringement lawsuit filed by GameVice in March 2018 asked the United States International Trade Commission to completely block imports of the Switch into the US. Sales of the Switch weren't affected by GameVice's lawsuit, and in October 2019, it was ultimately decided that Nintendo hadn't infringed on the patent. The Switch has seen an influx of ports from other systems, but some complain these multi-platform games often cost more on the Switch, which led to some coining the phrase Switch tax. While compiling data on the Switch's library of games, Nintendo news site Switcher compared the prices of games available on both the Nintendo eShop and Steam, and discovered a notable discrepancy in the price of multi-platform games. Digital-only games on both services generally cost 7.2% more on the eShop than on Steam, while games released both physically and digitally cost 17.8% more. Overall, games cost roughly 10% more on the eShop than they do on Steam. The main cause for this is the manufacturing cost of the Switch cartridges, which are notably more expensive to produce than the discs used by other systems, which in turn means the games are usually more expensive to purchase. Nintendo's policy also mandated all Switch games that get both a physical and digital release must have the same price in both formats. As physical Switch games are more expensive than physical games on other platforms, the digital versions are also more expensive on the eShop than they are on other digital storefronts, resulting in a sort of Switch tax. While some games had their prices changed for the system, other games had their content changed. The game Super Real Mahjong PV, which originally released on the Sega Saturn, came to the Japanese Switch eShop in March 2019. The game is a simple mahjong puzzle game, with a gimmick of rewarding players via anime nudity. However, the game was removed from the eShop shortly after its arrival due to some risque scenes that had insufficient censorship. Nudity in the game had been covered with a white bar of light in an attempt to avoid a Sero Z rating, an 18+ rating that usually leads to low sales due to a limited audience. However, the light bar hadn't been aligned properly, and some nudity could still be seen in the final game. This resulted in the game being temporarily removed from the eShop until a patch was developed to sufficiently cover up the nudity. Interestingly, this isn't the only adult mahjong game to be censored on the Switch. Zero Div's Tyson Hot Gimmick Cosplay Jan previously released on the PC and PlayStation 2, but was ported to the Japanese eShop in 2018. The game's release went off without a hitch, but a little while after, fans noticed the eShop page had changed. The game's splash image on the storefront had been swapped out for an edited, less lewd version. Another Switch title was found to be censored somewhat before it even released. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate leaked over a week before its street date, which led to a large chunk of the game's content being revealed on social media. This included parts of the game's Spirits mode, which celebrates a large number of gaming franchises. Not all of these franchises were represented in the same way as in their original games, almost certainly because of the game's low age rating. Art for several female spirits had their usual artwork censored to be less revealing. This included Mithra from Xenoblade Chronicles 2, who had her legs reshaded to look like she was wearing black tights, and her top was extended to cover more of her chest. Camilla from Fire Emblem Fates was also altered, with her chest being covered by her hair instead of it falling to the sides. Although some fans were annoyed at this, it's hard to deny that the changes were appropriate for an E10+ rated game. Despite this, Nintendo seems to be against censoring games. At a shareholders meeting in June 2019, Nintendo President Shuntaro Furukawa was asked about his stance on games being censored by gaming platform giants such as Nintendo. Furukawa responded, essentially saying he believed the ratings board is enough, along with the parental controls Nintendo offers. He even went as far to say that arbitrarily editing games could be damaging to the industry. This statement was noteworthy, as Sony had recently censored sexual content of games on their platform. Senran Kagura Burst Renewal, Nekopara Volume 1, Date Alive Rio Reincarnation, and Senran Kagura were all affected by Sony's policies on sexual content in games. Although Nintendo's stance seems to be anti-censorship, one of their most high-profile titles of 2019 was altered after its release. In September of this year, news circulated that a line spoken by the character Bernadetta in Fire Emblem Three Houses had been altered. Specifically, her English B support conversation with Byleth had been seemingly toned down in the title's 1.02 update. Translation enthusiast and Fire Emblem fan Cantopia was curious if this was really a case of censorship and investigated the updated dialogue and compared it to the original English and Japanese versions. Surprisingly, the language used in the English 1.02 update was closer to a literal Japanese translation. However, translating from Japanese is rarely this simple. Cantopia went on to explain how, although the literal idea of Bernadetta being tied to a chair as a training method to make her a good wife was intact, some of the nuance was lost. The original English was made more intense to convey Bernadetta's implied feeling on the matter, which would have been lost with a direct translation. Whether or not this can be called censorship seems to be up for debate. Some fans believe the updated text either doesn't change the intent of the line or is more authentic to the original Japanese version, while others believe toning down the English text is censorship regardless of what the change was for, and that it lessened the impact of the conversation with Bernadetta. Did you know? Before Nintendo became the video game powerhouse they are today, they produced toys and playing cards. Even legendary video game designer Shigeru Miyamoto's first project at the company was making package designs for a Disney-themed board game. But this business model would be drastically altered after the creation of the Game & Watch series, Nintendo's first successful entry into the handheld video game market. After the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, Nintendo's tried-and-true business model was in dire trouble. They struggled to stay afloat, with then-President Hiroshi Yamauchi experimenting with a variety of business ventures such as taxis and love hotels. While these ventures weren't successful, Nintendo saw some potential in the toy market, especially since they had some experience in the industry with themed playing cards. Gunpei Yokoi, who at the time was an engineer at Nintendo, brought one of their earliest successes, the Ultra Hand, an extendable arm that grabbed things from a distance. The Ultra Hand would go on to sell 1.2 million units, and Yokoi was eventually promoted within Nintendo to lead research and development one group. One day while Gunpei Yokoi was traveling on the bullet train from Tokyo to Kyoto, he noticed a passenger near him using a calculator as a toy to pass time. That's when Yokoi began to wonder if a portable gaming device would have a market. His epiphany led to the creation of the Game & Watch series, Nintendo's first portable gaming system. Yokoi's pitch to Hiroshi Yamauchi for the Game & Watch was a series of lucky coincidences. Yamauchi's personal driver was sick one day, and Yokoi was asked to drive Yamauchi's Cadillac. Yokoi loved loved foreign cars and was one of the few people at the company who could drive it. During the drive, Yokoi pitched his idea for Game & Watch to Yamauchi, who didn't seem particularly enthusiastic. Days later, executives from Sharp came to Nintendo, and Yamauchi enthusiastically brought Yokoi on to develop the idea. Nintendo ended up partnering with Sharp, known at the time for their work on calculators, in order to make the Game & Watch. For the series, Gunpei Yokoi wanted to create something that was small and could easily fit in people's hands and pockets discreetly. This is because Yokoi felt that businessmen would be embarrassed to pull out a big gaming machine in public. This led the team to focus on a small, rectangular design that could be inconspicuously held in their hands. However, this origin story might not be entirely accurate, and is actually up for debate. In an interview with Retro Gamer, Satoru Okada, who worked with Gunpei Yokoi closely, stated that the MB Microvision directly inspired Nintendo's Game & Watch series. Okada and Yokoi enjoyed playing games on it, but they didn't understand why it was so big. Even with different games on the MB Microvision, the graphics and gameplay were basically the same due to its 16 by 16 pixel display. The two imagined a smaller device with better graphics, and eventually settled on a calculator-like screen for the device. Since the events surrounding the Game & Watch's creation occurred over 40 years ago, and Gunpei Yokoi is unfortunately no longer with us, it's unlikely that we'll ever know the true origins of the series. The game Ball was the first title in the Game & Watch series, and went on sale on April 28, 1980, selling around 250,000 units. In Ball, players control a nondescript person who juggles balls. Ball has been re-released and remixed several times over the years, most recently with the Game & Watch Mario. One of the more surprising inclusions was with a Japanese exclusive DS title called Rakubiki Jiten DS, which was an electronic dictionary developed by Nintendo. By typing in Ball or Game & Watch in the dictionary, players can access the game Ball within the software itself, as well as the game Manhole. While playing, the games will even display the current time on your system, a nod to the game's original functionality that wasn't present in some of the re-releases on the Game Boy. Players can also use the control pad or the touchscreen to control both of these games. One of the last official Game & Watch titles was actually a 1991 game titled Mario the Juggler. It was the only Game & Watch released in the 1990s, and features a vibrant, colorful screen. Lakitu and a Hammer Bro make an appearance in this version, with both helping out Mario juggle the balls. Another interesting callback to Ball comes with the Game Boy camera. With the Game Boy camera, players could take a picture of their own face and superimpose it on the character from Ball, then play the game. Back when Gunpei Yokoi proposed the idea for the Game & Watch to Hiroshi Yamauchi, Yokoi was told that he needed to come up with multiple titles, as Nintendo wouldn't do just one. Ball was the first game Gunpei Yokoi envisioned, but he needed more, so he quickly threw together a whack-a-mole style game called Vermin. Despite the rushed design, Vermin became one of the best sellers for the initial batch of titles. Yokoi looked to anime and Japanese folklore for inspiration for the game's designs. Turtle Bridge was partly inspired by The Hair of Inaba, a story about how a rabbit tricked sharks in order to cross a body of water. Yamauchi would put intense pressure on Gunpei Yokoi in order to come up with ideas. In the Gunpei Yokoi's Game Museum book, Yokoi reflects on this pressure, saying, "Creating those new backgrounds was itself very challenging, and the president would just casually walk over and say, 'It's that time again, Yokoi, make me another 3 Game & Watch games.' I found the casualness of those requests exasperating, and privately I thought, come on, it's not that easy. Consider the guy who actually has to think all this up." The Mario series in particular saw several releases on the Game & Watch. Mario Brothers was a Game & Watch multi-screen title released in 1983. The multi-screen design would later play a part in inspiring the DS line of handhelds, but with the difference being that the Game & Watch would open horizontally like a book instead of vertically. In the game, players control Mario and Luigi as they package cakes. If the player loses, Mario is scolded by his boss. Mario Brothers for the Game & Watch would be re-released several times in the Game & Watch Gallery titles, with Bowser and Wario even making an appearance while the two brothers do the heavy lifting. Some of Nintendo's most important series also had entries in the Game & Watch, such as Donkey Kong, Balloon Fight, and The Legend of Zelda. In Game & Watch Zelda, players control Link as he fights 8 dragons through 8 dungeons. He gains pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom in order to save Princess Zelda and the world. Like many Zelda titles, if Link's hearts are full, he'll shoot a beam from his sword. Donkey Kong Circus was a 1984 title that actually serves as an unofficial prequel to the arcade Donkey Kong. In this title, Mario forces DK to juggle objects while balancing on a barrel. The game has colorful graphics and features Mario in a very similar style to the arcade game's art. The Game & Watch series re-released and reused a lot of concepts throughout its run. Donkey Kong Circus, which itself was a remake of Ball, was also a reskin of an earlier title called Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse and Donkey Kong Circus are so similar that Nintendo even swapped the product numbers during production. Mickey Mouse's product number is DC95, while Donkey Kong Circus is MK96, with the MK possibly referring to Mickey. Both titles are part of the Panorama Screen sub-series for the Game & Watch, but that wasn't the Mouse's only appearance on the handheld. Disney would see 2 other Mickey Mouse titles for the Game & Watch. Mickey Mouse was released within the widescreen sub-series, and Mickey and Donald were different versions of 2 other Game & Watch games titled Egg and Fire, respectively. Since the Game & Watch series ran for quite some time, it had a number of interesting sub-series. The Nintendo Versus series, which were arcade versions of Famicom titles with 2-player support, might have inspired the Micro Versus line of games for the Game & Watch. 3 titles were released for this series: Punch-Out!, Donkey Kong 3, and Donkey Kong Hockey. With Donkey Kong Hockey, the players control Mario and Donkey as they square off in hockey. This Game & Watch title would be the first ever Mario sports title, predating the NES Open Tournament Golf by 3 years. It's also interesting to note that Mario wasn't even the main star of the title, instead being relegated to the Player 2 spot. The Crystal Screen series were later iterations of Game & Watch, featuring a transparent screen. Climber is an interesting title that was never released in Japan, and would release in the United States 1 year after Ice Climber debuted, and it's possible the series was meant to be a spiritual sequel to Ice Climber. After the Game & Watch's success, there were a number of knockoffs and imitations. While shopping one day, Gunpei Yokoi heard the beeps from Vermin in a Taiwanese knockoff. When he purchased the unit and pried it open, he discovered that the knockoff soccer design just replaced the Vermin screen, with the internal system being exactly the same. However, Yokoi wasn't angry, just very surprised. Yokoi said, "Thus, when I see a knockoff of something I made, it's proof that my work has made a big impact, and that makes me very happy." Yokoi drew the original Game & Watch characters, but eventually entrusted the design process to a staff member who had skill in drawing manga. The Game & Watch character would be immortalized in the Super Smash Bros. Series from Melee onwards. Director Masahiro Sakurai would utilize a number of different Game & Watch titles within the character's moveset. When designing the character for Melee, Sakurai initially wanted to make his movements move frame by frame, but it was too jarring. Instead of actually being a 2D sprite with lo-fi animation, Mr. Game & Watch is a 3D character that's squished down on its Z-axis. When developing Mr. Game & Watch for Melee, Sakurai borrowed the original systems from the Asakusabashi branch of Nintendo for research. For the stage, Sakurai wanted techno-sounding music, which Hirokazu Ando, a musician at HAL, provided. One reference that was added to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate ended up getting cut before the game's release. This is because the forward smash attack initially included a culturally insensitive reference to a title called Fire Attack. In Fire Attack, players would control a cowboy who must hit Native Americans with a hammer in order to prevent them from lighting the cowboy's fort on fire. When the game was included in Game & Watch Gallery 4, the Native Americans were updated to be less in line with racist stereotypes. Nintendo changed the move before Smash Ultimate was released.
For today's episode, we'll be looking at trivia from a handful of Nintendo Switch titles. At the time of making this video, the Nintendo Switch is the latest of all current generation consoles. On top of that, it's the fastest selling console of all time in both Japan and the United States, selling just short of 3 million units in the first 3 months of release. More than anything, these record figures have been attributed to a high quality of exclusive titles on the system, such as Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and Mario Odyssey. With that said, let's start off by looking at one of these powerhouses, Super Mario Odyssey. In Odyssey, there's a Koopa that asks the player to trace the shape of an object around them by walking. The Koopa appears 3 times in the game, first asking the player to draw a circle around them, then a triangle, and finally a circle again. This seems odd, as you might expect the third shape to be something more difficult, as a triangle is harder to make with the game's controls than a circle. YouTuber Skelix found that the challenge was indeed originally more difficult. They found data for an objective in the game where the Koopa asks the player to draw a star around them instead. With the star's more complex geometry, it proves to be far more challenging. The difficulty of the objective may have been the reason it was replaced with the initial circle challenge. Jumping from a classic franchise to a wholly new IP, The fighting game ARMS wasn't always intended to be its own series. An early concept for the game was to feature a number of staple Nintendo characters from the company's popular series, such as Link and Mario. Issues arose when the team felt the game's aesthetic clashed with these characters, so they decided to create a new cast of characters instead. Designs began with the character's arms, and the team worked backwards from there to design a character who would make use of the various types of arms created. There are some exceptions to this rule, however. To begin with, the team considered characters using external devices, not their own limbs, in order to hit their opponents. However, this was eventually dropped. Another early idea was to make the game stand out amongst the crowded space of fighting games by positioning the camera directly behind the characters instead. This caused its own issues, however, as it became harder for the player to judge distances on the screen. This was solved by simply making characters' arms extend dramatically to hit their opponent, leading to the game's unique design concept. For Xenoblade Chronicles 2, writer Tetsuya Takahashi wanted to have the popular Square Enix artist and director of Kingdom Hearts, Tetsuya Nomura, on his team. Takahashi's desire to work with Nomura has existed for 20 years, so when the opportunity finally arose for a collaboration, Takahashi jumped at the chance. He told Time, "At the time, there was someone who was directing the Final Fantasy series, Mr. Yoshinori Kitase. Mr. Kitase was handling Final Fantasy, and I was doing Xenogears, and I wanted to work with Mr. Nomura. So I was waiting for the final call to be made, whether he was going to be working on the Final Fantasy series, or on this new title of mine. And then Mr. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, came and said, 'Tetsu is going to do Final Fantasy.' So I thought, okay, I've got to find myself a new designer. After our discussion with Nintendo went through and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was a go, I went directly to Square Enix, thinking that I'd be denied, asking if I could work with Tetsu. To my surprise, it was approved, and that's how it happened. Nomura ended up working on Final Fantasy VII, leading to manga artist Kunihiko Tanaka taking on the mantle of character designer for Xenogears and its follow-up Xenosaga. 20 years later, Tetsuya Nomura ended up designing the Torna organization for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the primary group of antagonists in the title. Influences for a game's design can come from unexpected places. The crossover tactical RPG, Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle, first took its inspirations from Nintendo's Mario Kart. Director Davide Soliani stated, "We thought that tactical games are known to be slow-paced, and they tend to be a little niche, so why not try to have something very dramatic and colourful and fast-paced? That's why our first reference was Mario Kart. How cool would it be to try to translate that kind of action into the combat of our game?" Surprisingly, for such a major collaborative effort between Ubisoft and Nintendo, the hero of the Rabbids' origin, Rayman, doesn't make any appearance throughout the game. The team did talk about including the hero in the game, but they decided against it after considering the Rabbids as their own franchise separate from Rayman. They saw the Rabbids as a blank canvas of sorts, which allowed the team to design characters that would fit with the Mario heroes closely. Miyamoto even encouraged the team to explore the crazy side of the Rabbids, wanting the team to involve more of their humor and flair. Another of Nintendo's biggest franchises saw its return on the Switch with Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Both versions of the game have numerous references to other media from Pokémon and beyond. The two Pokémon trainers Lass Ayuki and Lass Aoi are references to voice actors from the titular Pokémon. Lass Ayuki, the Pikachu Master Trainer, refers to Ayuki Otani, the iconic voice of Pikachu. Similarly, Lass Aoi, the Eevee Master Trainer, references Aoi Yuki, the actress for Eevee in the game. These aren't the only trainers whose names are references though. The Zubat and Golbat trainers are named Scientist West and Scientist Keaton respectively. These are of course taken from the names of Batman actors Adam West and Michael Keaton. The list of references from the Pokémon Masters goes on, with the Ghost Masters, Psychic Aaron, Danny and Ross, all referencing our boys over at Game Grumps. Aaron Hansen, Danny Avidan, and Ross O'Donovan. And finally, the Bird Master Trainers could potentially be references to the hugely popular animated series, The Simpsons. Though just speculation, the Bird Keepers Barney, Seymour, and Moe could be named after the Simpsons characters Barney Gumble, Seymour Skinner, and Moe Szyslak. More references to other media in Switch games can be found in Splatoon 2's Octo expansion. The names and taglines of every single level in the DLC are references to songs, films, and trends between the late 70s and the 90s. Just to name a few, Stick and Move Station is a reference to the 1979 film Rocky II, when Apollo Creed's trainer instructs him to stick and move.
And can't beat on points, you understand? Now stick and move.
The tagline for this stage is also a reference to boxing legend Muhammad Ali, and his iconic quip,
"Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee." Ah!
Maverick, Goose, and Iceman stations are all references to the 1986 film Top Gun. As well as this, all three stages feature taglines that reference Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone, the big banger from the movie's soundtrack. Labyrinth Station and its tagline both reference Jim Henson's bizarre Labyrinth movie from the same year. Splat Magic Splat is a parody of the line Dance Magic Dance from David Bowie's Magic Dance, which he performed in the film. Whack Fu Station alludes to the 90s fighting game Shaq Fu, with the tagline also being a reference to the Shaq Attack phrase. Another video game reference, this time for a Nintendo property, is Ink and Watch Station, of course referencing Nintendo's first line of handheld games, Game & Watch. Changes had to be made with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, as it includes every character in the series' history. This even includes the guest characters of the past, such as Snake. With Konami having gone through a rather unpleasant series of events between the release of Brawl on the Wii and Ultimate, it may not come as a surprise that this would affect their contribution to the game. In Brawl, Snake's series emblem was that of Metal Gear Solid's Fox Unit logo. With Ultimate, this was changed to the exclamation mark which appears after a soldier sees the sneaky sausage that is Snake.
Stop kidding around.
It's very likely that the reason for this change in emblem comes from the unfavorable departure of Metal Gear Solid creator Hideo Kojima from brand owners Konami. During Kojima's tenure with Konami, the former subsidiary, Kojima Productions, began using this logo as their own. It's possible that Konami had requested that the Fox logo be changed in order to disassociate the character from Kojima. The team behind Nintendo's Labo clearly wanted to show their love of detail within the software side of the package. In the game's digital tutorials on how to build the title's external cardboard devices, 3D models of the Switch's controllers, the Joy-Cons, are shown. Despite the fact that it is almost impossible to view, the 3D models of these Joy-Con are actually fully modeled on the inside, only being visible to players who would orient the software's camera to clip inside one of the devices.
Within 10 months of its release, the Nintendo Switch sold more units than the Wii U sold during its entire lifespan. By comparison, the Switch sold 14.86 million units in the first 10 months of its release, while the Wii U sold only 12.5 million units from its launch until it was discontinued in 2017. Although this is partly due to the Switch's unique and quite useful gimmick of functioning both as a home console and a handheld, its game library has no doubt been a big factor in its sales. Pokémon Sword and Shield certainly had a rough run up to its release, but upon players getting hold of the title, many have come to enjoy it. It's also become the fastest selling Switch game so far, selling more than 6 million copies in its opening weekend. And as you might expect, the game has quite a few interesting secrets that have already been found. One secret is that there's a very slight chance that a wild Pokémon will come to the player's Pokémon camp while they're playing in it and ask to join the player's team. If the player picks the yes option, then not only will the Pokémon join the camp, but the player will have also caught the Pokémon, and it will go into one of the player's Pokéballs. Another incredibly popular Switch game is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. The plot of the game's World of Light adventure mode sees Kirby as the sole survivor of a cataclysmic invasion, leaving the Pink Pudge to rescue the other fighters one by one. Interestingly, this was actually director Masahiro Sakurai's original vision for the plot of Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Subspace Emissary. This early storyline was mentioned during a 2008 Iwata Ask segment, where Sakurai said, "I had envisioned more of a serious tone for the story, something with some misfortune like a single character escaping total annihilation of his squadron and then fighting back while rounding up his allies." According to Sakurai in an interview with Famitsu, the reason why Kirby was the only one that survived Galeem's attack was because he was the only one who could plausibly escape using his Warp Star. This also made the character accessible to starters or newcomers to the game as a result of his speed and attacks. Some have pointed out that others should logically have been able to escape due to similar skills involving tremendous speeds, and that Sakurai, as Kirby's creator, may have just been a little biased in his choices. Another unused element from Brawl, which was used in Ultimate, was a voice clip for Snake.
There!
The voice clip in Ultimate for when Snake plants some C4 went unused in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, but is believed to have been used in the same way before it was cut. Kirby Star Allies received middling reviews, being praised for its art style, soundtrack, and overall gameplay, however being taken to the cleaners over its apparently incredibly easy difficulty. Despite that, one interesting Easter egg actually comes from the difficulty settings of one of the sub-games, the Ultimate Choice. Once the player has beaten the 6th difficulty, Fiery Showdown, or higher, the Soul Melter difficulty is unlocked. In the menu, with each increase in difficulty, Kirby's reaction gets more intense. The face he makes for the spiciest of difficulties is actually a reference to the episode Frog Wild from the Kirby anime series, Kirby Right Back At Ya. In the episode, Kirby is possessed by a demon frog that turns him evil. A fairly new addition to the Nintendo Switch's library is Platinum Games' Astral Chain. The game's sci-fi aesthetic is one of its more visually defining features, but the title originally started out with a fantasy setting. The initial concept had players use magic, but after the development team realized that there were lots of other games with fantasy settings, it was reworked into a more cyberpunk-inspired setting based on animes that the game's creator, Takahashi Taura, enjoyed watching, such as Ghost in the Shell and Appleseed. Another more recent Switch title was the fairly well-received Yoshi's Crafted World. A lot of attention had clearly gone into the design of the game's world, even more than would be apparent by just playing the game. In an interview with Nintendo Dream that was translated by Nintendo Everything, the game's director, Masahiro Yamamoto, confirmed that the entire game actually takes place in a kindergarten class within the Mario universe. This also informed the themes each level had, with elements in the game being based on what you would find in a school for young children, such as a sandbox. Yoshi's Crafted World also has quite the range of Easter eggs and secrets. One noteworthy nod references one of Mario RPG's outings, Mario and Luigi's Superstar Saga. In the game, a can of Starbean's iced coffee can be spotted in the flipside version of the stage Poochie's Magma Run. This is a reference to the Starbean's Cafe, which was prominently featured in Superstar Saga. One game that took Nintendo and Sega fans by surprise was Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games Tokyo 2020. The surprise in question was an entire game mode based around the 2D games that defined the franchises involved. Another piece of news that took gamers by surprise came on October 2nd, when it was revealed that just one day prior, Superstar Saga developers Alpha Dream had filed for bankruptcy. The company cited sluggish revenues and high development costs as the reason for filing. After the news broke, Liam Robertson, who creates Game History Secrets here on Did You Know Gaming, tweeted that he knew of one last project Alpha Dream worked on. Alpha Dream's involvement in the project hadn't yet been revealed, but the mystery game turned out to be Mario and Sonic 2020. This would be the last game Alpha Dream ever worked on, contributing to development alongside Sega and a few other studios. Another studio that's known to aid with development on large projects is Bandai Namco. As well as helping develop Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the studio also aided Nintendo with the development of Mario Kart Tour, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and ARMS. This was recently revealed on the company's website, which stated they'd partially implemented in-game and 3D visual assets for courses and characters for Mario Kart Tour, and that they'd produced about half of the game's bonus challenges. The site also states that Bandai Namco produced about half of the visual assets for courses and characters in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and that they made about half of the visual assets for stages and fighters in ARMS. One Nintendo Switch game that's hot off the presses is The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. When the game was initially revealed, some fans were torn over the game's visuals. That said, they proved to be a selling point for many, who found the cute aesthetic with a heavy depth of field very alluring. The game's director, Eiji Aonuma, has shed some light on why the game looks the way it does, explaining that the tilt-shift effect was inspired by the original Game Boy version's vast but small world on the console's 66mm screen. Aonuma said, "When I played the original Game Boy version, it was a small screen, and it felt like a small world, but very vast. And so it kind of had this tilt-shift perspective, so that's why I thought this diorama-like art style would be perfect for the remake." Moving from one Switch Zelda title to another, it's no secret that Breath of the Wild has an incredible amount of Easter eggs and references within it, and this goes for the game's downloadable content as well. Just a heads up, this is a minor visual spoiler for the end of the DLC. Inside the last room in the Sword Monk Shrine, after completing the Trial of the Sword DLC, there are 7 monks with their arms in different positions. The pose of each monk represents poses of the 7 sages from the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Zelda's pose is taken from the final battle against Ganon, and the other 6 sages' poses are from inside the Chamber of Light after defeating the corresponding temples that release each sage.
Did you know? Metroid was originally called Space Hunter. This term can still be seen in the game's instruction booklet where it refers to bounty hunters as space hunters. According to a developer interview in the Japanese magazine Nintendo Dream, Nintendo wanted to use the term bounty hunter but couldn't rewrite the text in time for the game's release. They later settled on the name Metroid, which came from combining the words metro, as in a metro subway, and android, which is strange considering the game's protagonist, Samus Aran, isn't an android. That said, Samus's identity wasn't fully realized until partway through the game's development. Her gender was decided after developers said, "Hey, wouldn't it be kind of cool if it turned out that this person inside the suit was a woman?" Samus's physical appearance in Super Metroid was based on the actress Kim Basinger. Her second name, Aran, came from soccer player Pele, whose real name was Edison Arantes do Nascimento. Samus was referred to as a he in the instruction booklet, though this may have been a cover-up to ensure the end reveal was shocking. Samus originally had unique animations for walking left and right, rather than having the same animation mirrored for both directions. These unused sprites are actually still in the game's data. Samus's movement also went through some changes. At first, the developers thought she moved too slow on screen. They increased her speed, but this increase made it hard to maneuver through small areas and on small platforms. Thus, the environments were made larger to compensate, resulting in the expansive labyrinths the series is known for. Samus's iconic design, dressed in the round-shouldered Wario suit, didn't debut until Metroid 2: Return of Samus. In the first Metroid, the different suits that Samus equips, the Wario suit and the Power suit, were the same shape but had different colors. The Game Boy's visuals lacked color, so for Metroid 2, these suits were redesigned so players could tell them apart. Also, the name Wario suit was a mistranslation from Japanese and was meant to be called Barrier suit, as stated in Metroid's instruction booklet. In Super Metroid, Samus initially appeared naked when she died. However, the developers gave her clothes to avoid controversy outside of Japan. Samus also spoke as she died, but the voice was removed for sounding too sexual. Super Metroid's title screen was also changed during development. The graphics for this can be pulled from the game's ROM to reveal the original title, Metroid. The Super Metroid boss Crocomire was planned to appear in Metroid Zero Mission. Not only are the boss's graphics present, but Crocomire's behavior is partially programmed into the game as well. A Metroid fan called TrueNar68 created a hack for the game that fleshes out Crocomire's movements to resemble the Super Metroid boss fight. There's also a plethora of Crocomire concept art for Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, suggesting Crocomire was meant to appear in that game as well. The boss Kraid was set to make an appearance in Metroid Prime. The graphics for Kraid resembled the Super Metroid design, but included metal prosthetics similar to those found on Meta Ridley. As a result, fans dubbed the boss Meta Kraid. There's also concept art for Kraid without metal prosthetics, showing it had multiple stages of development before being dropped completely. There's also an unused ice boss in Metroid Prime. Its color scheme, spikes, and the position of its tusks resemble the Sheegoth, so it's possible this creature is somehow related to them. It's also possible that the boss Thardus may have replaced this ice monster. You face Thardus in a cold climate, but some early animations show Thardus as a lava-themed boss. Thardus could have been altered and repurposed in order to fill the void by removing the ice boss. Some of the roars made by the bosses in Super Metroid greatly resemble roars from the Godzilla movies. When Crocomire dies, it lets out what seems to be the roar of Titanosaurus. And the same roar seems to be used again when the boss Phantoon is hit. Dragon's cry also resembles the cry of the Godzilla monster, Anguirus. There are many similarities between the Metroid and Alien franchises. These similarities have been acknowledged by Metroid's co-creator, Yoshio Sakamoto. He stated that the first Alien movie influenced the creation of Metroid, and that his team thought the presentation in Alien was a good match for the Metroid world they had already put in place. In addition to basic design influences from the Alien franchise, some events from the first 4 Metroid games resemble events from the first 4 Alien movies. Here are just a few examples. After hatching, the first forms of the alien xenomorphs and the first forms of the Metroids both latch onto the heads of their victims, and both species have multiple stages of metamorphosis. Both Metroid and Alien have female lead protagonists, both of which narrowly escape explosions and are shown half-clothed at the ending. The boss Ridley also shares his name with Alien movie director Ridley Scott. In the sequel to Alien, Aliens, Ripley travels to the source of the alien xenomorphs, the moon LV-426. In Metroid 2, Samus travels to the source of the Metroids, SR-388. Both stories center around the heroines attempting to exterminate the alien threat in their universe. Aliens introduces the Queen Alien, Metroid 2 introduces the Queen Metroid. In the third Metroid game, Super Metroid, the Key Hunters have the ability to spit acid, and in Alien 3, a xenomorph also spits acid. In the fourth Alien movie, Alien Resurrection, Ripley is cloned and the embryo of an alien queen is extracted from her body. The cloning process unites alien DNA with Ripley's, turning her into a human-alien hybrid. In the fourth Metroid game, Metroid Fusion, Samus becomes infected with a virus, but is later cured with a vaccine. The vaccine uses Samus's cellular sample taken from the remains of the baby Metroid that she came into contact with in Super Metroid, and this vaccine ultimately gives her Metroid-like powers. Weyland-Yutani Corporation clones xenomorphs from Ripley's embryo to use as weapons. Similarly, the Galactic Federation uses the baby Metroid's cells to clone a series of Metroids, and both labs end up being destroyed by Ripley and Samus. Xenomorphs don't attack Ripley as she's a human-alien hybrid and they think she's one of them. With the exception of the Omega Metroid, the Metroids don't attack Samus, presumably for the same reasons. It's possible that Metroid 2 was going to receive a DX remake, much like Link's Awakening DX. In the April 1998 issue of the German club Nintendo magazine, a full-color image of Metroid 2 was shown. It's not known if the image was representing a game in development or if it was simply a mock-up. A fan remake of Metroid 2, known as Another Metroid 2 Remake, sparked a comment from Retro Studios artist Benjamin Sprout, saying, "I've always thought it'd be awesome to remake Metroid 2. A group of us at Retro even discussed doing it as a side project at one point. To our knowledge, the idea never progressed." There are lots of unused test rooms in Metroid Other M. Most are fairly basic and lack detail, but one of them stands out. This room is actually from Ninja Gaiden 2, where you fight the boss Resetsu at the top of a building. The background tower is no longer present in the model, but the structure is mostly intact. There's a room shown in the trailer for Metroid Fusion where Samus uses a power bomb against zombie scientists. This part of the game was removed, but the room itself is still in the game's code. The crystals from Wario Land 4 can also be found in the game's code. This is because Metroid Fusion was made using Wario Land 4's game engine. In Metroid Fusion, when you unclog the exhaust fans in Sector 1, there's a secret hidden in the blockage. If you look to the top left corner of the rubble, you can see a partly disguised Nintendo GameCube.
Did you know? The character Wilbur will occasionally spell out words in the NATO phonetic alphabet, where words are used to communicate a letter, but there's a sly secret in his dialogue. When Wilbur spells out the word now, he says November Oscar Whisker. In real life, the NATO phonetic word for the letter W isn't whisker, it's whiskey. This was clearly changed to remove any reference to alcohol. But this isn't the only secret surrounding Wilbur. Wilbur and his brother Orville are clearly named after Orville and Wilbur Wright, inventors of the airplane. Wilbur's birth date is even December 17th, a reference to the day the Wright brothers conducted the first ever flight of the Wright Flyer in 1903. However, their names in the Japanese game reference something else entirely. Wilbur's Japanese name is Rodri, a shortening of Rodriguez. This is the name of an island which was once home to a relative of the dodo, the Rodriguez solitaire. In Japan, the Rodriguez solitaire is known as the Rodriguez dodo, strengthening this connection. Orville's name, on the other hand, is Mori, taken from the word Mauritius, an island nation where dodos once roamed. In the Spanish version of New Horizons, the villager Raymond is named Narciso. One interpretation of the word is a Spanish name for the ancient Greek figure Narcissus. Narcissus was self-obsessed, and is the origin of the word narcissism. The game's Spanish localizers may have included this reference due to Raymond's smug personality. The villager Sherb also has nods to Greek mythology in other languages. In the German game, he's called Morpheus, referencing the Greek god of the same name associated with sleep and dreams. CJ's Italian and French names, Castorino and Pollux respectively, also reference mythology. They're named after the twins Castor and Pollux from Greek and Roman mythology, who are considered the twin sons of Zeus or Jupiter. Interestingly, Castor is also the scientific name for the beaver genus. On the flip side, CJ's name in Japanese is Justin. This would make him Justin the Beaver, likely a nod to Canadian singer-songwriter Justin Bieber. On top of this, beavers are often associated with Canada, as is Justin Bieber. The villager Sid is named Ponkasu, or Punks in Japan. This name seems to have influenced a few references in other versions of the game. Firstly, his name in the English, Russian, Dutch, German, and Italian versions is likely a nod to punk rock star Sid Vicious of Sex Pistols fame. The Spanish version of the game takes a different direction, however, naming him Ramon, after punk rock band The Ramones, and perhaps its lead singer, Joey Ramone. Audie's name is a variation of Monica in most language versions of New Horizons. This isn't the case with their English name, however, which is likely a nod to a real-life person, and this time, someone in the Animal Crossing crossing community. Audrey is an 87-year-old grandma who went viral on Twitter in early 2019 after her grandson tweeted out her impressive 3,580-hour playtime in Animal Crossing New Leaf. In the game, Audrey adopted the username Audie as she played. Since this is such a unique name, it's highly likely that someone at Nintendo wanted to reward her dedication by referencing her in New Horizons. There are some other interesting secrets about the franchise's villagers. In an interview with GameCult, New Horizons developers explained that when brainstorming ideas for new characters, the team thinks about the character's role in the game before any designs are made. After landing on a role, they choose the most appropriate species of animal. This is how it was done even in the first Animal Crossing, with one example being Blathers. Since owls are often associated with wisdom, the museum curator role was made an owl. Production on Animal Crossing New Horizons began right after the release of Animal Crossing New Leaf in 2012, before the team even knew the Nintendo Switch existed. The first decision made was to set the game on a deserted island. According to New Horizons director Aya Kyogoku, this was meant to shake the series up. Kyogoku said, "When we started developing New Horizons, we felt that if we didn't change the elements of players moving to a village, nothing would really change. Even the interaction with animals wouldn't change either." This wasn't the only thing they wanted to shake up. In older games in the series, there wasn't much for players to do at night, as shops would close and villagers would go to bed. This was one reason crafting mechanics were added to New Horizons. Because the mechanic can be used at all hours, players would have more to do even while shops and characters were inaccessible. Another reason was to give players more customization options. During development, the team also learned that in prior Animal Crossing titles, some fans would reset their game multiple times until they found a town layout that they liked. In light of this, the team added the ability to terraform the island. Just like crafting, terraforming was designed to be accessible at any time of the day. These mechanics push players to engage more with the island as a whole rather than focusing on just their homes or villagers. Another change was the inclusion of Nook Miles, which were designed to slowly introduce each of the game's mechanics so as not to overwhelm new players. They were also designed to tempt existing players out of their old playing habits and experiment with playing the game in different ways. Tying the game to the real-time clock enables players to time travel, where a player changes their Switch's clock to skip ahead in the game and access future events early. For New Horizons, however, Nintendo chose to add seasonal events as DLC, instead of having the events built in. This means players can't time travel to access seasonal events, which led many to assume that Nintendo implemented this change to curb time traveling. This doesn't seem to be the case, however, as both Kyogoku and New Horizons producer Hisashi Nogami have gone on record saying they don't consider time traveling cheating. These developers also explained how some features were inspired by the failings of past Animal Crossing games. The local multiplayer mode in New Horizons, Party Play, is an idea the team wanted to have in City Folk back on the Wii. After the Wii game was released, the team realized they could have included some sort of simultaneous play on a single console with two Wii remotes. When it came time to make New Horizons, the team made sure to include this decade-old idea. Although there were some concerns that New Horizons sales numbers would be hurt by the COVID-19 pandemic, the game sold a stunning 1.88 million copies in Japan within its first 3 days. This beat out the Switch's then record holder, Pokemon Sword and Shield, by roughly 500,000 units. This doesn't even include digital sales of the game. New Horizons also bumped up sales on Nintendo Switch and Switch Lite consoles in Japan by over 585%. Worldwide, New Horizons launch week sales beat those of all other Animal Crossing game launches combined. Although worldwide sales were high, New Horizons hasn't been approved by the Chinese government to be officially sold in the country. This didn't stop retailers and resellers on Chinese auction sites from importing copies of the game, however. Initially, sales seemed to be accepted by the Chinese government, but due to the COVID-19 situation, many pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong couldn't continue their demonstrations in public. Instead, the protesters began using New Horizons as a digital space to facilitate their protests and communicate with other protesters. In response, the Chinese government banned stores from selling New Horizons in early April. According to reports, the ban also covers New Horizons themed Switches and the game's merchandise. But Hong Kong and Chinese gamers haven't let that stop them. They've resorted to buying New Horizons from Nintendo's eShop digitally through different regions. Some have even privately reached out to sellers to buy copies of the game under the table. They aren't the only group taking Animal Crossing seriously, however, with New Horizons' turnip market becoming just as serious as Wall Street's to some. For those unaware, players can buy turnips in New Horizons every Sunday, which can be sold throughout the week week, ideally for a profit. However, turnips will rot the following Sunday, making them worthless. The buying price of turnips changes twice daily, leading to a high-stakes game where players can land huge profits or losses. The uncertain nature of the market has prompted players to band together in an attempt to game the system. For instance, the subreddit r/AC turnips allows users to post their town's turnip prices and set up visits to sell turnips, usually in exchange for tips in the form of bells, items, or Mystery Island tickets. Others, like Tom Riley and his co-workers, use Slack, an app designed for employees to communicate online. Riley's server has a customized bot that alerts everyone if a member's turnip prices are over 200 bells. Continually updating turnip prices on Slack has become part of the daily routine for many members of the group. Opening your island's airport to fellow turnip traders isn't without risk, however. Some players have experienced turnip traders stealing items from their island or have been scammed. To combat this, some players have actually hired others to act as security guards on their island. Crowdsourcing good turnip prices is only one tactic players have used. Others have turned to coding price prediction calculators, such as asdturnip.com, in hopes of forecasting their town's turnip prices in advance. New Horizons was intended to bring friends and their communities together, and managed to bring two specific communities together in a way that shocked its developers. Fan art depicting Animal Crossing's Isabelle with the main character of the Doom series flooded the internet in the days leading up to New Horizons and Doom Eternal's shared March 20th, 2020 release date. Even Doom's official Twitter account joined in on the fun. When the phenomenon came to the attention of New Horizons' team, they were awestruck by the creativity and popularity of the pairing. Nagami celebrated what the Isabelle and Doomslayer crossover meant for gaming at large, telling IGN, "Obviously the game's genres are completely different. It's so great to see that two different fandoms are coming together and hyping up the gaming community and gaming culture itself. It's a really great thing to see." The Doom Twitter account wasn't the only one won over by New Horizons. Xbox's official Twitter account posted custom Xbox-themed Animal Crossing clothing for fans to download and wear. This followed Microsoft's Executive Vice President of Gaming, Phil Spencer, sharing a tweet of Twitter user iGazeGirl, aka Becky. Becky is an ambassador for Special Effect, a charity focused on leveling the playing field for gamers with disabilities. Becky had connected an Xbox adaptive controller to her Nintendo Switch, which allowed her to remap the Switch's controls to allow her to play New Horizons using just her head.